There's a bench in the park near my apartment that I used to avoid. Not for any logical reason. It wasn't broken or covered in graffiti or anything like that. It was just off. Something about the way it sat beneath the massive oak tree, almost swallowed by the shadows of its branches, made it feel like it wasn't really part of the park. Like it had been placed there by someone who didn't understand benches, or the people who might sit on them. It was old, older than the rest of the park by the looks of it. The wood was worn smooth, the kind of smooth that only comes from countless hands and years of weather. Its iron legs were twisted into ornate shapes, almost too elaborate for something so simple. The whole thing had the air of a forgotten artifact, something left behind and slowly absorbed by the world around it. I walked by that bench every day for years and never once thought about sitting on it. Until the day I did. It was one of those strange afternoons where the sky couldn't decide if it wanted to rain or shine. The clouds hanging low and heavy, their edges fraying like old fabric. I was restless, pacing the park without really knowing why. My headphones were in, but I wasn't listening to anything, just the dull hiss of static from a broken connection. I passed the bench, as usual, but then I stopped. I can't explain what made me stop. There was nothing different about it. Same worn wood, same twisted iron legs. But for some reason, I turned around, walked back to it, and sat down. The moment I did, the world shifted. Not in a dramatic, ground-shaking way. It was subtle, like stepping into a room and realizing it's a few degrees colder than the one you left. The air felt heavier, the sounds of the park, kids shouting, dogs barking, the distant hum of traffic, faded into a soft, muffled hum. I took out my headphones, but the static stayed, buzzing faintly in the back of my mind. And then I noticed the carving. It was etched into the wood of the bench, almost invisible unless you were looking right at it. Just a single line of words, the letters uneven and shallow, like they'd been scratched in with something blunt. Sit. Wait. Watch. I ran my fingers over the words, half expecting them to feel warm or alive somehow. But the wood was just wood, smooth and unremarkable. The words didn't mean anything to me, and yet I couldn't stop staring at them. That's when I saw him. The man was sitting on the bench across the path, facing me. I hadn't noticed him before, but he wasn't the kind of person you'd notice. Everything about him was beige. His coat, his shoes, even his face seemed faded, like he'd been washed out by too many seasons in the sun. He wasn't looking at me, though. He was staring at something behind me. I turned, but there was nothing there. Just the oak tree, its branches twisting into the sky like veins. When I turned back, the man was gone. I blinked, my heart skipping a beat. The bench across from me was empty now, the space where he'd been sitting undisturbed. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined him, but then I noticed something on the ground. It was a coin. It wasn't anything special, just an ordinary coin, scuffed and tarnished, lying in the dirt where his feet should have been. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It was heavier than I expected, the edges worn smooth. The year on it was strange, though, 2037. I laughed, more out of confusion than anything else. A misprint, I thought. Some kind of novelty coin someone had dropped. But when I looked closer, I saw something else. There was a face etched into the coin, but it wasn't any president or historical figure I recognized. It was a woman, her hair pulled back in a tight braid, her expression sharp and knowing. Around the edge of the coin, in tiny, precise letters, was an inscription. Time isn't yours to hold. I put the coin in my pocket, suddenly feeling like I shouldn't be holding it out in the open. The static in my mind buzzed louder for a moment, then faded, and the air around me shifted again. The sounds of the park came rushing back. The kids, the dogs, the traffic. Everything was normal. I didn't tell anyone about the coin. Not because I was afraid they wouldn't believe me, but because I wasn't sure I believed myself. I left it on my desk at home, next to a stack of unread books, and tried to forget about it. But the next day, when I walked past the bench, I found another coin. This one was different. It had the same weight, the same worn edges, but the year was 1994, and the face was of a man this time. His expression was stern, his eyes shadowed. The inscription on this coin read, "Wait, and it will come to you." I didn't sit down that day. I kept walking, the coin burning a hole in my pocket as I tried to make sense of it. But the day after that, I found another coin, and then another. Each time, it was the same. A different year, a different face, a different message. Some of the years were far in the past, others impossibly far in the future. The faces ranged from kind and serene to cold and calculating. The inscriptions never repeated, but they all felt connected, like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't see the edges of. I started sitting on the bench more often, though I didn't always find a coin. Sometimes I'd sit for hours, staring at the oak tree or the people passing by, waiting for something to happen. Other times, I'd barely sit down before the air shifted and the static buzzed in my head again. One afternoon, a woman sat down next to me. She looked ordinary, jeans, a sweater, a tired expression, but there was something about her that made me uneasy. She didn't say anything at first, just folded her hands in her lap and stared straight ahead. "You've been finding them, haven't you?" she said after a while, her voice low. I turned to her, startled. "Finding what?" She gave me a small, knowing smile. "The coins." I didn't answer, but my silence must have been enough, because she nodded. "They don't come to everyone," she said. "Just the ones who are looking for something." "What do they mean?" I asked, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. Her smile faded. "They mean whatever you let them mean. That's the trick." Before I could ask her anything else, she stood and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of joggers and dog walkers. I still don't know what the coins are, or why they keep appearing, but I keep them all, tucked away in a box under my bed, their strange inscriptions etched into my memory. Sometimes I wonder if they'll stop coming, or if I'll wake up one day and the bench will be gone, like it was never there to begin with. But until then, I sit and I wait and I watch. Because maybe, just maybe, the next coin will have an answer. I was midway through brushing my teeth when the mirror blinked. It wasn't subtle. One moment, my reflection was staring back at me, toothpaste foam bubbling at the corners of my mouth. The next, it squeezed its eyes shut, held them tight for just a second, and then opened them again. I froze, toothbrush in midair, staring at myself, or what I thought was myself. But my reflection didn't move. It kept looking straight at me, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of its mouth. That wasn't normal. I don't smile when I brush my teeth. "Finally," it said. The toothbrush fell from my hand and clattered into the sink. My reflection rolled its eyes. "Seriously?" it said, tilting its head like a disappointed parent. "You drop things now? What are you new?" I didn't say anything. What was I supposed to say? Talking to your reflection isn't exactly a normal Tuesday night activity. I took a small step back, half expecting the mirror to return to normal if I blinked or turned away, but the reflection just raised an eyebrow. "Don't bother," it said. "You're not dreaming. This is happening." What? My voice cracked, and I hated how shaky I sounded. "What's happening?" The reflection sighed, crossing its arms as though I was wasting its time. "All right, fine. I'll make this simple. You're late. We don't have much time." "Late for what?" I stammered. "For your life," it said. Then it leaned forward, close enough that its nose almost touched the glass. I instinctively took another step back. "The question is," it continued, its tone dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "do you even want it back?" "Back? I have my life," I said, louder than I meant to. The words came out defensive, like I was trying to convince myself more than my reflection. The reflection chuckled, low and bitter, like it knew a joke I wasn't in on. "Oh, no. You have the imitation. You know, the day-to-day, checklist existence. Wake up, work, sleep, repeat. It's adorable, really. But the real thing? The life you were meant to have? You dropped it somewhere. Left it behind. Forgot where you put it. I don't understand," I whispered. "No kidding," it said, exasperated now. "Look, I'd explain the details, but we're on a bit of a clock here. Just trust me. You need to find the doorway. The cracks are already starting to show." "Doorway? What cracks?" The reflection sighed again, louder this time, as if it was dealing with a particularly slow student. "You'll see," it said. "You always do. But you'll need this." Before I could ask what it was talking about, the reflection reached down out of frame, into a place my body couldn't reach. Like the bottom edge of the mirror was a window instead of a flat surface. When its hand came back up, it was holding a small brass key, intricately carved, with tiny teeth that looked like they could open a very old, very specific lock. "Take it," the reflection said, holding the key up to the glass. "I can't." I gestured vaguely at the mirror. "I mean, it's just a mirror." The reflection rolled its eyes again. "You're overthinking this," it muttered, and then it pushed the key through the glass. The key didn't shatter the mirror. It didn't even ripple, like you'd expect in some cheesy sci-fi movie. It just passed through, as if the glass had never been there at all. I staggered back as the key dropped into my open hand, solid and real, its metal cold against my palm. "There," the reflection said, straightening its posture and dusting its hands off. "That wasn't so hard, was it?" I stared at the key, my mind spinning. What do I do with this? "You'll know when you see it," the reflection said, its voice softening slightly, almost like it was trying to be kind. Then, without warning, it froze. The faint smirk disappeared, and its eyes darted to something over my shoulder. Well, that's my cue. Good luck, by the way. Try not to mess it up this time." "Wait, what?" I turned around instinctively, but there was nothing there. Just the pale yellow walls of my bathroom and the faint hum of the fluorescent light. When I looked back at the mirror, my reflection was normal again, silent, mimicking my every move. I stood there for what felt like forever, clutching the key in my hand. My heart was pounding, and I half expected the mirror to speak again, but it didn't. I glanced at the key. Its surface seemed to shimmer faintly, as though it was reacting to the light, or maybe to my touch. The cracks started showing up the next day. At first, they were small, barely noticeable. The corner of my kitchen floor had a faint hairline fracture running through the tile, one I swore wasn't there the night before. Later, on my walk to work, I spotted another crack on the side of a building, zigzagging upward like lightning frozen in stone. Nobody else seemed to notice. I stood there for minutes, staring at it, while people shuffled past me with coffee cups and distracted glances. I even pointed it out to someone, a woman in a red scarf, and she just gave me a confused smile, like I'd asked her for directions to another planet. By lunchtime, the cracks were everywhere. They weren't just in the buildings and sidewalks. They were in the air. Invisible at first, but when I squinted, I could see faint lines shimmering in the space around me, splitting and branching like a spiderweb made of light. I reached out to touch one, but my hand passed through it, tingling faintly. The whispers came back that night. They weren't in the mirror this time. They were in the cracks. Soft, murmuring voices that didn't form words but felt impossibly urgent, threading themselves through my thoughts until I couldn't ignore them anymore. They wanted me to follow them. By midnight, I was walking again, barefoot, just like the reflection had warned. The city was empty, or maybe I'd left the part of it that belonged to everyone else. The cracks were glowing now, faint and gold, like veins of molten metal running through the dark. They pulsed faintly, guiding me, pulling me forward. I didn't realize where I was heading until I saw the door. It was old, wooden, and didn't belong to any building I recognized. It just stood there, freestanding in the middle of the park, its edges lined with carvings that matched the pattern on the key in my pocket. The whispers grew louder as I approached, and the cracks converged on the door, their golden lines sinking into the wood like roots burrowing into soil. I hesitated, the key heavy in my hand. Somewhere deep in my chest, I felt that same tug, the pull of something bigger than myself, something I couldn't understand but couldn't ignore. The whispers faded into silence, waiting. I slipped the key into the lock. The door opened, and then everything I thought I knew fractured, just like the world around me. I always hated the library on the east side of town. There was nothing outwardly sinister about it. No Gothic towers, no gargoyle statues glaring from the roof. It wasn't even particularly old, just a squat, utilitarian building of faded brick with windows that seemed too small for the walls they were set into. But there was something about it that had always put me off, something that tugged at the back of my mind like an itch I couldn't scratch. I hadn't been there in years, not since middle school, when my friends and I dared each other to sneak into the basement. The place had a basement, but the staff always acted like it didn't exist, deflecting questions with tight-lipped smiles and awkward excuses. The few times we asked if we could see it, they would shake their heads and say something vague about renovations or restricted access. But we'd seen the door, plain as day, tucked away in the corner behind the biography section, half hidden by a rolling cart of books no one ever seemed to borrow. It took weeks of planning, but one Saturday afternoon, when the library was nearly empty and the lone librarian on duty was distracted by a man arguing about overdue fines, we made our move. There were 3 of us, me, Sam, and Leah. Sam was the one who'd come up with the idea, and Leah had gone along with it because she was bored and didn't want to spend another weekend at home. I hadn't wanted to do it at all, but I wasn't about to be the only one left out. The door was locked, of course, but Sam had swiped a bobby pin from his sister and spent 10 minutes fumbling with the lock before it finally clicked open. The air that hit us when the door swung inward was cold and damp, carrying the faint smell of mildew and something metallic. We hesitated at the top of the stairs, peering into the darkness below. The fluorescent lights overhead didn't reach far, and the stairwell seemed to stretch endlessly downward, swallowing the light as though it were hungry. "We're not actually going down there, are we?" Leah whispered, her voice trembling just enough to make me feel less alone in my unease. "Of course we are," Sam said, already stepping onto the first stair. "What's the point of coming this far if we chicken out now?" I wanted to argue, but Sam had that look in his eyes, the one he always got when he was trying to prove something, though I never understood what. Leah followed him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as though she were bracing herself for the cold. I was the last to step through the door. The stairs creaked under our weight, the sound amplified in the narrow stairwell. I counted each step as I went, my heart hammering harder with every number. By the time we reached the bottom, I'd stopped counting at 20. The basement wasn't what I'd expected. It wasn't dusty or cluttered, like basements usually are, but clean and stark, with walls painted a flat, featureless gray. The air was even colder down there, and the faint metallic smell was stronger, making my nose wrinkle. The room was lit by a single bulb dangling from the ceiling, casting a pale circle of light that barely reached the corners. And in the middle of the room, there was a door. It wasn't like the basement door upstairs. This one was taller, narrower, and painted a glossy black that seemed to absorb the light. There was no handle, no hinges, no visible way to open it. "What the hell is that?" Leah asked, her voice echoing faintly. "I don't know," Sam said, stepping closer, "but it's weird, right? Why would they keep something like this down here?" "Maybe it's locked for a reason," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. Sam ignored me, running his fingers along the edge of the door. "There's no keyhole," he said, frowning. "How do you even open it?" "Maybe you don't," Leah said, taking a step back. I stayed where I was, staring at the door. There was something about it that made my skin crawl, like an itch beneath my skin I couldn't reach. It felt wrong. Not just out of place, but wrong in a way I couldn't explain, as though it didn't belong to the same world the rest of us did. Sam pressed his palm against the surface of the door. "Don't touch it," I snapped, louder than I meant to. My voice startled even me. Sam shot me a look. "Relax. It's just a door." But it wasn't. The moment his hand touched the surface, the room shifted. It wasn't something you could see, exactly. The walls didn't move, and the light didn't flicker. But I felt it, deep in my chest, like the floor had tilted ever so slightly beneath me. "Sam, stop," Leah said, her voice trembling. "I didn't do anything," he said, pulling his hand back. The room fell silent. And then, the door opened. It didn't swing inward or outward. It didn't slide or creak or make any sound at all. One moment it was closed, and the next it wasn't, the black surface dissolving into a yawning void. Beyond the door was darkness, not the kind you see at night, with faint hints of shapes and shadows. This was absolute, a void that seemed to stretch endlessly, pulling at the edges of the room like it was trying to swallow us whole. "What the hell?" Sam whispered, taking a step back. The air around us grew heavier, colder, as though the void were reaching out, pressing against our skin. Leah grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my sleeve. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then something stepped through the door. I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't a person, or an animal, or anything that should exist. It was tall and thin, its shape shifting and flickering at the edges, like smoke trapped inside a glass jar. It didn't have a face, just a vague impression of features that seemed to melt and reform with every passing second. The three of us stood frozen as it moved closer, its steps silent on the concrete floor. It stopped just inside the circle of light, tilting its head as though it were studying us. "What do you want?" Sam said, his voice barely above a whisper. The thing didn't answer. It just stood there, its featureless face turning slowly from one of us to the next. And then, without warning, it reached out. Its hand, or what I assumed was its hand, brushed against Sam's arm, and he screamed. It wasn't a normal scream. It was raw and guttural, a sound that tore through the room like a knife. Leah and I stumbled back as Sam collapsed to the floor, clutching his arm. The thing didn't move. "Run," Leah whispered, her voice shaking. I didn't need to be told twice. We bolted up the stairs, not daring to look back. The door at the top was still open, and we burst through it, slamming it shut behind us. We never talked about what happened after that. Not to each other, not to anyone. Sam's arm was fine, at least, physically. But he wasn't the same after that day. None of us were. The library closed a few months later, and the building was eventually torn down. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of the door and the way the air felt when it opened. I don't know where it led, or what we let out, but I think it's still here. There's a coffee shop at the corner of my street that no one seems to go into. I've lived in the neighborhood for 3 years, and in all that time, I've never seen a single customer walk in or out. The sign above the door is faded to the point of illegibility, and the window display is one of those odd assortments of objects that don't seem to have anything to do with coffee. A brass telescope, a stack of yellowed newspapers, a dusty bird cage with no bird. I'd always assumed it was one of those businesses that exists as a front for something else, a shell for laundering money or hiding secret meetings. You know, the kind of thing you joke about but don't think too much of because it feels safer that way. The thing is, I never even thought to question it until one night last week, when I was walking home late and saw the light inside. It was faint, barely visible through the fogged-up windows, but it was definitely there. A warm, golden glow, flickering slightly, like candlelight. I stopped on the sidewalk, bags of groceries digging into my palms, and stared at it. I could make out faint shapes moving inside, shadows stretching and warping across the walls. For a moment, I thought I saw a hand, long and thin, reaching toward the window, but it vanished before I could be sure. The rational part of me screamed to keep walking. People like me don't investigate strange lights in places they don't belong. But there was something about the way the shadows moved that felt almost inviting, like they were beckoning. Against my better judgment, I crossed the street and stood in front of the door. Up close, the building looked even older than I'd realized. The paint on the door was peeling, revealing layers of wood beneath, and the handle was one of those brass knobs that looks like it belongs on an old mansion rather than a coffee shop. I half expected it to be locked, but when I turned the knob, it opened with a soft creak. The smell hit me first. Coffee, yes, but something richer, deeper, like spices I couldn't name, earthy and sweet and just slightly metallic. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was overwhelming, the kind of scent that wraps itself around you and settles in your lungs. The inside of the shop didn't look like I'd expected. It was small, much smaller than it appeared from the outside, and dimly lit by a single chandelier that hung too low, casting long shadows across the floor. The walls were lined with bookshelves, not filled with books, but with jars. Hundreds of them, all shapes and sizes, their glass fogged slightly, their contents murky and indistinct. And behind the counter, standing perfectly still, was a man. He was tall, unnervingly so, with a thin frame that seemed to stretch too far, as though he'd been pulled upward by some unseen force. His face was pale and narrow, and his eyes. I'll never forget his eyes. They weren't unkind, but they were wrong. Too bright, too sharp, like they saw things I couldn't. "Welcome," he said, his voice low and smooth, like the first note of a cello. "I've been waiting for you." I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. My tongue felt heavy, my throat dry, like I'd forgotten how to form words. He smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Don't be afraid," he said, gesturing to the counter. "You're here now. That's what matters." I forced myself to step forward, my body moving before my brain could protest. The counter was old and wooden, its surface worn smooth by years of use. On it sat a single coffee cup, steaming faintly, the liquid inside impossibly dark. "I didn't order anything," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't have to," he replied. "It's already yours." I stared at the cup, the steam curling upward in delicate spirals. There was something hypnotic about it, the way it moved, the way it shimmered. I didn't want to drink it. Every instinct in me screamed not to, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. "What is it?" I asked. He tilted his head slightly, as though the question amused him. "Something you've forgotten," he said. "Something you've been looking for." I glanced around the room, at the jars lining the shelves, at the way the light from the chandelier seemed to flicker just slightly too fast. "I don't understand," I said. "You will," he said, "when you're ready." I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was the way he was looking at me, or the strange pull of the scent in the air. Maybe it was curiosity, or fear, or something deeper, something I couldn't name. But I picked up the cup, its warmth seeping into my palms, and I took a sip. It wasn't coffee. I don't know how to explain it, but it wasn't coffee. It was thick and cold and bitter and sweet all at once, like drinking a memory. My vision blurred, the room around me spinning and shifting, and for a moment, I wasn't in the shop anymore. I was in my old bedroom, the one from the house I grew up in, the smell of rain drifting in through the open window. I could hear my mother's voice calling me from downstairs, soft and warm, the way it used to be before she got sick. I could feel the scratch of the carpet under my feet, the weight of the quilt on my bed. And then, just as quickly, I was somewhere else. A park. Maybe. The sun was shining, and I was running, laughing, someone's hand in mine. I couldn't see their face, but I knew them. I knew them, in the way you know the shape of your own shadow. The memories came faster and faster, overlapping, colliding, until they weren't memories anymore. They were pieces, fragments of something bigger, something I didn't understand. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I was back in the shop, the cup empty in my hands, the man behind the counter watching me with that same unreadable smile. "Do you remember now?" he asked. I shook my head. "Remember what?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached beneath the counter and pulled out a jar, small and round, its glass fogged like the others. He set it on the counter in front of me, and I realized, with a sinking feeling, that it had my name on it. "This is yours," he said. "You left it here a long time ago." I didn't want to touch it, but my hands moved on their own, lifting the jar from the counter. The contents were murky, swirling, shifting, like smoke trapped in glass. "What is it?" I whispered. His smile widened. "The rest of you." Before I could respond, the lights flickered again, and the room dissolved into darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was standing outside, the coffee shop dark and silent behind me. My hands were empty. My groceries were gone. And for the life of me, I couldn't remember my own name. When I was 14, my dad brought home a mannequin. He didn't say why, or where he got it, or even acknowledge that bringing a 6-foot-tall plastic man into our living room was, at the very least, unusual. He just set it up by the bay window, leaned it against the wall like it belonged there, and went back outside to unload groceries from the car. The mannequin was wearing a gray suit, shiny and cheap-looking, the kind of thing you'd see on display in the window of a failing department store. Its face was blank except for 2 dots for eyes and a vague suggestion of a mouth, and its right hand was stuck in a permanent wave. I hated it immediately. "What's with the mannequin?" I asked when my dad came back inside. He glanced at it, like he'd forgotten it was there. "Oh, that. I thought it might be useful." "For what?" He didn't answer. My dad had a habit of saying things like that, little half-statements that didn't mean much but left you wondering anyway. It wasn't until after my mom died that I realized he wasn't trying to be mysterious. He just didn't always know how to explain himself. For a while, the mannequin just sat there, propped up against the wall like a weird, unwanted house guest. My dad didn't move it, and I was too stubborn to touch it, convinced that doing so would somehow validate its existence. I tried to ignore it, but it wasn't easy. Every time I walked through the living room, I'd catch it out of the corner of my eye, a pale, humanoid shape standing just a little too still. One night, about a week after it arrived, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud, just a faint thump, like something soft hitting the floor. I rolled over and stared at the ceiling, telling myself it was probably the cat. But when I glanced at the door, I saw a shadow move across the crack of light at the bottom. My throat tightened. I listened, straining to hear over the pounding of my own heartbeat, but the house was silent. After what felt like forever, I got up, opened the door, and crept down the hallway toward the living room. The mannequin was lying on the floor. For a moment, I just stared at it, my brain fumbling for an explanation. Maybe it had tipped over somehow, I thought. Maybe the cat had knocked it down, though that seemed unlikely given how heavy it was. Slowly, I walked over and stood it back up, leaning it against the wall where it had been before. Its hand was still frozen in that weird little wave, like it was mocking me. The next morning, I asked my dad if he'd moved the mannequin. He just shook his head and said, "Must have fallen over." I wanted to believe him, but something about it didn't sit right. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing other strange things. Small things, things I could explain away if I tried hard enough. A chair in the dining room slightly out of place. A picture frame on the mantel tilted at an odd angle. Once, I found the remote control on the floor, halfway across the room from where I'd left it. My dad didn't seem to notice anything was off, or if he did, he didn't say anything. Then one night, I saw it move. I'd been watching TV, flipping aimlessly through channels, when I glanced over at the mannequin. It was still in its usual spot, standing by the window. I turned back to the screen, but a few seconds later, something made me look again. It was closer. Not by much, maybe a foot, maybe less, but enough that I noticed. My mouth went dry. Slowly, I stood up and took a step toward it, my legs trembling. It didn't move again. It just stood there, frozen and lifeless, the same way it always did. I told my dad about it the next morning. He gave me the same dismissive shrug he always did and said, "You've got an overactive imagination." I wanted to argue, to make him understand that this wasn't just in my head, but the words caught in my throat. He looked so tired, so worn down by everything, and I didn't want to add to his burden, so I stopped mentioning it. But I didn't stop watching. At night, I started locking my bedroom door. I'd lie in bed with the covers pulled up to my chin, listening for any sound, any sign that it was moving again. Sometimes I'd hear faint creaks or taps, but when I worked up the courage to check, everything would be exactly where it should be. One day, I came home from school to find the mannequin wearing a new outfit. The cheap gray suit was gone, replaced by a pair of jeans and a flannel shirt that I recognized as my dad's. I stared at it, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. "Why'd you dress it up?" I asked when my dad got home. He frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" "The mannequin," I said. "You put clothes on it." He looked at me like I just told him the sky was green. No, I didn't. I wanted to believe he was joking, but the look on his face told me he wasn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the mannequin standing in the dark, its blank face staring at me through the door. Around midnight, I got up, grabbed a hammer from the toolbox in the garage, and dragged the mannequin outside. It was heavier than I expected, its limbs stiff and awkward, but I didn't care. I was done with it. I took it to the edge of the yard, where the trees grew thick and wild, and smashed it into pieces. The sound of the plastic breaking echoed through the night, sharp and hollow. When it was done, I gathered the fragments into a trash bag and shoved it into the bin by the curb. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. The next morning, my dad didn't say anything about the mannequin being gone. He didn't even seem to notice. For a while, things went back to normal. Then, a month later, I came home to find another mannequin standing in the living room. This one was different. It was smaller, thinner, and dressed in a bright yellow raincoat. Its face was just as blank, but its pose was more lifelike. One hand on its hip, the other holding a plastic umbrella. I dropped my backpack and ran to find my dad. "Why is there another mannequin in the house?" I demanded. He looked up from the newspaper, frowning. "What mannequin?" "The one in the living room." He stared at me for a moment, then got up and followed me to the living room. It was empty. The mannequin was gone. I moved out of that house when I turned 18. My dad stayed behind, living alone in that creaky old place until he passed away a few years later. When I went back to pack up his things, I found a box in the attic labeled "Mannequins." Inside, there were old photographs of our living room, each one showing a different mannequin standing by the window. Some of them I recognized. Most of them I didn't. I don't know what they were, or where they came from, or why my dad had kept them. I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that first mannequin, standing in the corner with its hand raised in that strange, silent wave. And I wonder if it was saying goodbye, or hello. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, though I don't know how it made it to me. My apartment didn't have a mailbox. The building manager had ripped them out years ago and told us to figure it out if we wanted to receive mail. Amazon packages were usually dumped in a pile by the stairwell, half of them stolen before anyone got to them. But there it was, sitting on my kitchen counter when I came back from work. A yellowed envelope with my name written in tight, spidery handwriting I didn't recognize. No return address. No stamp. I thought maybe one of my neighbors had dropped it off, but that didn't make sense. No one in this building knew my name. Hell, I barely knew their faces. We all existed like shadows, moving in and out of the building without acknowledgement, heads down and headphones in. The envelope was heavier than it should have been, the paper thick and stiff, like it had been cut from a book cover. I turned it over in my hands, trying to decide if I should open it. Something about it felt old, but not in the charming, sentimental way of a love letter from decades ago. No, this felt like it had been waiting for someone to find it for far too long, like it had grown restless. I opened it, of course. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. The handwriting matched the front of the envelope, tight and slanted. The ink slightly smudged in places. "Do not throw this away," it read. "You've been chosen. Follow the instructions carefully. The time will be 2:16 a.m. The place will be where the black dogs gather. Come alone. Don't bring light." That was it. No signature. No explanation. I read the letter 3 times, each word sticking to my brain like a burr. It was absurd, obviously. Some kind of prank, maybe. But why me? Why this letter, in this building, where mail barely even functioned? I tried to laugh it off, but the words had hooked themselves into me, dragging behind every thought for the rest of the evening. I found myself glancing at the clock obsessively, watching as the minutes crept closer to midnight. By 1:30, I was sitting on my couch, fully dressed, the letter folded neatly in my jacket pocket. I didn't know why I was going. I didn't even know where I was going. Where the black dogs gather wasn't exactly a clear set of directions. And yet, I felt like I did know. The place wasn't far, just a block from my apartment, where the city seemed to sag into itself. It was one of those lots that people forget exist, overgrown with weeds and surrounded by a half-collapsed fence, the kind of place that kids dare each other to run into at night, but no one actually does. I don't know how long I stood at the edge of the lot, staring into the darkness, before I heard it. A low, guttural growl, followed by the shuffle of something moving through the brush. My heart hammered against my ribs, and I nearly turned back. But then I saw them. The dogs. There were 5 of them, maybe 6, their bodies hunched and lean, their eyes glinting faintly in the dark. They weren't barking or snarling, just watching, their heads tilted slightly, their movements unnervingly coordinated. They didn't look feral, but they didn't look right either. Their fur was patchy, matted in places, and the way they moved was almost human. I froze. One of them stepped forward, its paws crunching softly against the gravel. It stared at me, its head cocked like it was trying to decide what I was. Then, without warning, it turned and walked deeper into the lot. The others followed, their dark shapes melting into the shadows. I don't know why I followed them. The lot was darker than it had any right to be. There was no moon that night, and the streetlights on the corner cast only the faintest glow. The air was cold and damp, heavy with the smell of wet earth and something faintly metallic. The dogs moved in a slow, deliberate line, their shapes barely visible ahead of me. I stumbled over a piece of rusted metal, catching myself before I fell, and when I looked up again, they were gone. Ahead of me was a doorway. It was freestanding, just like the payphone in an old dream I'd once had. The frame was warped, the wood dark and splintered. But the door itself looked new, smooth and unmarked, painted a deep red that seemed to drink in the darkness around it. The dogs were nowhere to be seen, but I felt them. I felt them in the air, in the earth beneath my feet, in the static buzz that had begun to fill my ears. The letter's words came back to me, unbidden. Don't bring light. I didn't have a flashlight on me anyway, but my phone was in my pocket. It felt wrong to pull it out, to flood the space with anything brighter than the dim glow of the city. I reached for the door handle. It wasn't cold, like I'd expected. It was warm, almost too warm, as though someone had been holding it moments before. The door swung open silently, revealing nothing but blackness. Not darkness, blackness. It was like the space beyond the door had been erased, a void that sucked in sound and light and air. Something moved inside. I stepped back instinctively, my pulse thundering in my ears. The movement wasn't human, or animal, for that matter. It was slow and fluid, like ink spreading through water. And then it spoke. You came. The voice wasn't a voice. It wasn't sound at all, but a vibration, a presence that pressed against the inside of my skull. It was neither male nor female, neither kind nor cruel. It simply was. I don't know why I'm here, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to know, it replied. You just have to choose. Choose what? The air shifted, the void seeming to ripple at the edges. For a moment, I thought I saw faces in the darkness, dozens of them, blurred and indistinct, their mouths moving soundlessly. To stay, the voice said, or to leave. My throat tightened. What happens if I stay? The void didn't answer. And if I leave? The air grew heavier, the static buzz in my ears intensifying until I thought my head might split open. The choice is yours. I should have run. I should have turned around and never looked back. But something about the door, about the voice, about the impossible weight of the moment, held me in place. I thought about the letter, about the words that had haunted me all day. I thought about the dogs and the way they'd led me here without question, as if they'd known I would follow. I stepped through. The void closed around me, and the world fell away. I don't remember what happened next. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment, the letter sitting on my kitchen counter as though it had never been opened. But the words were different now. Thank you for choosing. We'll see you again soon. The payphone was waiting for me outside. The first time I noticed the street lamp outside my apartment blink, I thought it was just a bulb on its last legs. It happened as I was coming home late from work. One of those nights where the world feels dimmer than usual, like the universe forgot to charge its batteries. I barely glanced at the flickering light and went inside, too tired to care about much of anything. But then it blinked again, and again, until I realized it wasn't random. The pattern was deliberate. Blink, pause, blink, blink, pause, blink. Morse code. I'm not proud to admit this, but my first thought wasn't fear or confusion. It was annoyance. I was exhausted, and now, apparently, I was going to have to deal with a haunted street lamp trying to communicate with me. I stood in my doorway, grocery bags in hand, and glared at it. What do you want? I muttered under my breath. The lamp blinked again. 3 short flashes, then 3 long, then 3 short. SOS. Of course, I said, dropping my bags on the floor and stepping back outside, my irritation slowly giving way to curiosity. The light pulsed softly, almost apologetically, as if it knew how ridiculous this all seemed. I didn't know Morse code beyond SOS, but I had my phone. I opened a translator app, aimed it at the blinking light, and waited. For a moment, the lamp stopped, as if gathering its thoughts, and then it began. Help me. I stared at the translation on my screen, blinking back at the lamp like a deer caught in headlights. "Help you?" I said out loud. "You're a street lamp." The light blinked twice. "Yes." "Okay," I said slowly, because I had officially crossed the threshold into the kind of absurdity that only seems to happen in movies or dreams. "How?" The light flickered rapidly for a few seconds, the translator struggling to keep up. The app spat out something garbled. "Stuck? Can't leave. Darkness. Can't leave?" I echoed, trying to make sense of the words. "You're a lamp. You don't go anywhere." The light flashed angrily, as if offended by my lack of imagination. Trapped. Not supposed to be here. I looked up and down the street. It was empty, quiet, just the occasional hum of a car passing in the distance. The other lamps stood tall and silent, their steady glow unbroken. Just this one was different, this one pleading. "Okay," I said, stepping closer, lowering my voice like I didn't want the other lamps to overhear. "Who trapped you?" The blinking slowed, hesitant. "Don't know. Can't remember. Long time." Something about that answer sent a shiver down my spine. I looked up at the lamp, its metal frame coated in years of rust and grime, its bulb glowing faintly like a tired eye. I had no idea what I was dealing with, but it felt old, older than it looked. "What do you need me to do?" The lamp flickered with relief. "Find the box." "Basement." "What box?" "Wooden. Locked. Keys lost." This was becoming less like a conversation and more like a scavenger hunt. "And what am I supposed to do with it?" "Burn it." The word flashed so quickly I almost missed it. I stared at the lamp, half expecting it to elaborate, but it didn't. It just waited, its light steady now, as if the act of asking for help had drained it. "All right," I said, more to myself than to the lamp. "Fine. Basement it is." The basement in my building was a damp, poorly lit cavern that smelled like mildew and regret. It wasn't exactly a place I visited often, but I knew where the entrance was, an old wooden door at the end of the hall, the kind of door that creaked theatrically when you opened it. I grabbed a flashlight from my kitchen drawer and headed downstairs, the beam cutting through the darkness as I pushed the door open. The basement was worse than I remembered. Boxes piled haphazardly in every corner, cobwebs strung like garlands between exposed pipes. The walls were lined with dusty shelves crammed full of unclaimed junk, broken lamps, moldy books, a bicycle with a flat tire. "Box," I muttered, stepping over a broken chair. "Wooden. Locked. How hard can it be?" The answer, very hard. I spent the better part of an hour sifting through boxes, only to find cardboard, plastic, and metal. No wood. No locks. Just a whole lot of garbage that looked like it had been down here since the building was constructed. I was about to give up when my flashlight beam landed on something in the far corner of the room. A wooden box, small and unassuming, tucked beneath an old tarp. My heart skipped a beat. I crossed the room and knelt in front of it, brushing away layers of dust and cobwebs. The box was about the size of a shoebox, its surface carved with strange symbols I didn't recognize. A heavy brass lock dangled from the latch, tarnished but intact. This had to be it. I picked it up, surprised by its weight. Something inside rattled softly, like loose stones. I didn't try to open it. Something told me that wouldn't be a good idea. The lamp hadn't mentioned what to do if the box was locked, but I wasn't about to go back upstairs and ask. I grabbed a rusted crowbar from one of the shelves and used it to smash the lock. The sound echoed through the basement, sharp and metallic, and for a moment, I thought I heard something else, a low, whispering hiss, like air escaping from a tire. The lock fell away. I didn't open the box. Not yet. Instead, I carried it upstairs and out to the parking lot, where I'd left a metal trash can I used for barbecues. The lamp was watching me, its light steady, waiting. I dropped the box into the trash can, poured lighter fluid over it, and struck a match. The moment the flames caught, the lamp flickered violently, its light dimming and flaring like a heartbeat. The box hissed and popped as it burned, the symbols on its surface glowing briefly before turning to ash. I don't know what I expected to happen. Some kind of dramatic, world-ending event, maybe, or a ghostly figure rising from the flames. But all that happened was silence. The lamp stopped flickering. Its light returned to a steady, calm glow. Is that it? I asked, half expecting it to ignore me now that its task was complete. The lamp blinked once. Thank you. And then it went dark. The next day, the lamp was gone. A maintenance crew showed up in the morning, removed it without fanfare, and replaced it with a newer, shinier model. I watched from my window as they carted the old one away, its bulb shattered, its metal frame bent and broken. I haven't seen anything like it since, but sometimes, when I walk through the parking lot at night, I catch myself glancing at the new lamp, half expecting it to blink. Would you have burned the box? Or would you have opened it first, just to see? Because some nights, I wonder what was inside, and whether I did the right thing. I first noticed the post-it notes a week after I moved into my new apartment. At first, I thought they were mine, something I'd written during the chaos of unpacking and forgotten about. The first one was on the bathroom mirror, stuck slightly crooked and curling at the edges. It read, in neat, blocky handwriting, "Don't forget to turn off the oven." I hadn't used the oven that day. I peeled it off and crumpled it in my hand, chalking it up to a leftover from the previous tenant. The second note came 2 days later, on the inside of the fridge door. "Milk expires on Friday," it said. It was written in the same careful handwriting, the letters perfectly spaced like someone had taken their time. The thing was, my milk did expire on Friday. I checked the label 3 times just to be sure. I don't know why I didn't throw that one away. I left it there, stuck to the fridge, like a tiny yellow mystery I couldn't bring myself to solve. By the time the third note appeared, I knew something was off. I found it on my nightstand when I woke up. It hadn't been there when I went to bed. "You left your keys by the door," it said. Sure enough, my keys were still dangling from the lock, visible from where I stood. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I called the landlord, trying to sound casual as I asked about the previous tenant. "Oh, her," he said, barely paying attention. "She was a quiet one, kept to herself. Moved out in a hurry, though. Left the place spotless. Why, is there a problem?" "No," I lied, staring at the post-it still on my nightstand. "Just curious." I wanted to believe the notes were harmless. Some elaborate prank, maybe, or a really dedicated neighbor with access to sticky paper. But there was something about them, something specific and unsettling, like they were written just for me. I started checking every corner of the apartment, opening every drawer, searching for cameras, microphones, anything that could explain how someone knew where my keys were or when my milk expired. I found nothing. No signs of tampering, no tiny red blinking lights. Just me, my apartment, and the creeping sense that I wasn't alone. The notes kept coming. "Don't forget your umbrella. It rained that day. You're out of bread." I was. "Call your sister back." Her missed call was still sitting in my notifications. I stopped crumpling them up. Instead, I stuck them to the wall above my desk, arranging them in a neat little grid. I thought maybe if I studied them long enough, I'd find a pattern, a clue, something that made sense. But all I found were reminders, little nudges, like the kind you set on your phone to keep your life from unraveling. And that was the strangest part. The notes weren't threatening. They weren't sinister. If anything, they were helpful, like someone was trying to look out for me. Someone who knew me better than they should. One night, after a particularly exhausting day at work, I came home to find a new note stuck to the inside of my front door. "You need to rest," it said. I stared at it for a long time, my bag still slung over my shoulder, the keys dangling from my hand. I don't know why, but that one got to me. I peeled it off the door and held it in my hands, running my thumb over the letters. The ink didn't smudge. The handwriting was as perfect as ever. I felt a lump rise in my throat, a weird mix of gratitude and frustration. I wanted to say thank you. I wanted to scream at whoever was doing this to leave me alone. Instead, I wrote back. I grabbed a pen and one of my own post-its, scrawling the words, "Who are you?" in shaky handwriting. I stuck it to the fridge, where I knew they'd see it. Then I went to bed, my heart pounding as I stared at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen. When I woke up, there was a reply. "You don't need to know that," it said, the handwriting just as neat as ever. I should have been terrified. A stranger was leaving notes in my apartment, answering my questions, watching me while I slept. But instead of fear, I felt curiosity. Whoever they were, they didn't seem like a threat. They seemed like someone who cared. The notes became a conversation. Why are you helping me? I wrote one night. Because you need it, they replied the next morning. Do I know you? No. Are you human? The reply took 2 days to appear. Yes, mostly. That one sent a shiver down my spine, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Do you live here? I asked. In a way, they wrote back. What does that mean? No answer. Weeks passed, and the notes became more personal. They stopped reminding me about groceries and umbrellas and started saying things like, you don't have to feel guilty about leaving work early, or it's okay to cry sometimes. They felt less like reminders and more like reassurances, like someone was reading my thoughts and trying to ease the weight I didn't realize I was carrying. I started leaving the notes up around the apartment, not just on the wall above my desk, but on the fridge, the bathroom mirror, the bedside table. They made the place feel less empty, less like I was living alone. One night, after a particularly bad fight with my sister over the phone, I left a note that simply said, I don't know what to do. The reply was waiting for me in the morning. Say you're sorry. She'll understand. I did. She did. Whoever, or whatever, was leaving the notes, they were right. About everything. But then, one day, they stopped. No new notes on the fridge. No reminders on the door. Nothing. At first, I thought maybe I'd scared them off, asked too many questions, pushed too hard. I left a note anyway. Where did you go? No answer. The apartment felt unbearably quiet without them. The silence pressed against my ears, making the space feel too big, too empty. I kept looking for new notes, checking the usual places, even leaving little questions here and there, hoping for a response. Weeks went by, then months. I stopped expecting anything. The grid of notes above my desk stayed where it was, a quiet monument to the strangest time of my life. And then, one morning, as I was rushing out the door, I saw it. A single post-it stuck to the mirror in the hallway. I'm still here, it said. That was all. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Instead, I peeled the note off the mirror and stuck it in the middle of the grid above my desk. I never got another note after that. But sometimes, when the apartment feels too quiet, I find myself looking at the grid and thinking about whoever, or whatever, took the time to remind me to rest, to call my sister, to buy bread. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. I still don't know. Would you want someone like that in your life? Or would the not knowing drive you insane? Because honestly, I think I'd take the mystery over the silence any day. When I was 25, I accidentally became a beekeeper. I didn't mean to. It just sort of happened. I was working a dead-end temp job at the time, spending most of my days in a gray cubicle answering calls from people who were convinced their printers were possessed. My evenings weren't much better. Cheap takeout, Netflix, and a half-hearted attempt at convincing myself I'd eventually do something meaningful with my life. Then one day, my upstairs neighbor, Ed, knocked on my door holding a shoebox. Hey, he said, in his usual gruff tone, do you know anything about bees? I didn't, and I told him so. Ed shrugged and handed me the shoebox anyway. Well, you're about to learn, he said, and then he left without another word. I stood there in my doorway, holding the box like it might explode. Inside, there was a cluster of bees, tiny, golden bodies vibrating with a barely contained energy. They weren't flying around, which I took as a good sign, but they were definitely alive. There was something oddly hypnotic about the way they moved, a chaotic yet purposeful rhythm that I couldn't look away from. I found Ed in the stairwell the next day and asked him, "Why the hell did you give me a box of bees?" He shrugged again, as if the answer were obvious. "They were in my window frame. Figured you'd know what to do with them. You're always reading those science books." I wasn't, but I had left a copy of A Brief History of Time on the coffee table once, and I guess that was enough to give Ed the impression that I was the building's resident genius. "What do you expect me to do with them?" I asked. He squinted at me like I was missing something fundamental. "I don't know. Keep him. Or don't. They're just bees." That night, I did what any sensible person would do. I Googled what to do with bees in a box. The results were surprisingly unhelpful. Most websites assumed I either wanted to kill them, which I didn't, or that I was already some kind of apiarist extraordinaire. I ended up on a message board called BChat, where a user named BuzzTheory told me I could try to move them to a proper hive. How do I get a hive? I typed. BuzzTheory replied within seconds. Make one. You've got cardboard, right? I wasn't sure if I was being pranked, but by that point, I didn't have a better plan. I spent the next few days watching YouTube videos about makeshift hives and reading articles with titles like Beekeeping for Absolute Beginners. I learned about brood combs, drone bees, and something called a waggle dance, which sounded like a dance craze from the 90s, but turned out to be how bees communicate. Meanwhile, the bees in the shoebox seemed fine, though I had no idea how long they'd last. I started leaving little drops of sugar water for them, feeling both ridiculous and weirdly responsible. It was like having a pet, except my pet could fly and might sting me if I screwed up. Eventually, I built them a hive out of an old wooden crate I found in the alley behind my building. It wasn't perfect, but it was sturdy, and I lined it with wax paper like one of the videos had suggested. Moving the bees was another story. I'd bought a cheap pair of gardening gloves and a mesh veil that I rigged up with duct tape and an old bike helmet, but I still felt wildly underprepared. As I carefully tipped the shoebox into the crate, the bees poured out in a shimmering wave, their tiny wings buzzing like an electrical current. For a moment, I thought I'd made a horrible mistake, but they settled in quickly, crawling over the comb frames I'd improvised and disappearing into the nooks and crannies of their new home. I sat back on the concrete floor of my balcony, heart pounding, and watched them explore. Over the next few weeks, something strange happened. I started spending more and more time with the bees. I'd sit on the balcony with a cup of coffee, watching them come and go, their little bodies covered in specks of pollen. I learned to tell the difference between workers and drones, started recognizing their patterns and habits. It was fascinating, the way they worked together, each bee playing a tiny but essential role in this intricate, buzzing society. Compared to the monotony of my office job, it felt like watching life in its purest, most purposeful form. Ed stopped by one afternoon while I was refilling the sugar water feeder. He leaned on the railing, squinting at the hive. "They're still alive, huh?" he said, sounding vaguely impressed. I told him about the hive, about how the colony seemed to be thriving. He nodded, then said, "You know, my cousin's got a farm upstate. Keeps bees, too. If you ever want to get serious about it, I can give you his number." I laughed it off at the time. I wasn't a beekeeper. I was just someone who'd accidentally ended up with a box of bees. But the bees had a way of getting under your skin. Not literally, thankfully, though I did get stung a couple of times when I got too close without my gear. It wasn't the pain that stuck with me. It was the idea that I'd overstepped, that I'd disrupted something I didn't fully understand. The bees weren't pets, and they weren't pests. They were something else entirely, something I couldn't quite put into words. By late summer, the hive had grown too big for the crate. I knew I'd have to move them to a proper setup, but I didn't have the money or the space to do it myself. Reluctantly, I called Ed's cousin, a soft-spoken man named Will who drove down from the farm with a gleaming wooden hive strapped to the back of his truck. Together, we transferred the bees to their new home, while working with the calm precision of someone who'd done this 100 times before. When we were done, he turned to me and said, "You've got a good colony here. Strong. You sure you want to give him up?" I didn't know how to answer. In the end, I let him take the bees. It felt like the right thing to do. They'd have more space, more resources, and someone who actually knew what they were doing. But the apartment felt empty without them. I'd gotten used to their constant hum, the way they filled the space with a kind of quiet, purposeful energy. It wasn't until they were gone that I realized how much I'd needed them. Not just the distraction, but the sense of connection to something bigger than myself. A few months later, I quit my job. I didn't have a plan, just the vague sense that I wanted to do something that felt meaningful, something that felt alive. I ended up calling Will again, asking if he needed help on the farm. He laughed and said he could always use an extra set of hands. When I got there, the first thing he did was take me to the hive. The bees were still there, thriving, their new home tucked away in a sunlit corner of the property. I stood there for a long time, watching them come and go, their tiny bodies glowing gold in the afternoon light. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. So here's my question. Have you ever stumbled into something that changed your life in a way you didn't expect? Something small and strange that grew into something bigger, something that mattered? And if you did, what did you do with it? Did you let it go? Or did you follow where it led? The first time I met Ezra, he was barefoot in a gas station parking lot, holding a pineapple like it was a precious artifact. It was late at night, and I had just pulled in to fill up my car. The station was nearly empty, save for a couple of sleepy-looking truck drivers and a teenager half-heartedly sweeping near the entrance. That's when I saw him, standing next to the air pump, staring at the pineapple in his hands as though it held the answers to life's deepest mysteries. At first, I thought he might be drunk, or high, or both. But then he looked up, his eyes locking onto mine with a startling intensity, and said, "Do you think this is ripe?" I froze, unsure if he was talking to me or just thinking out loud. He took a step closer, holding the pineapple out like an offering. "Here, feel it," he said. "Is it ripe? It feels ripe, doesn't it?" I hesitated, glancing around the parking lot to make sure I wasn't about to get ambushed by some kind of pineapple cult. Sure," I said, awkwardly placing my hand on the fruit. "It's tricky, right?" he continued, ignoring my obvious discomfort. "Because you can't trust the color. The color lies. You have to go by smell, or weight, or the way the leaves tug out. But even then, it's a gamble." "It seems fine," I said, mostly because I didn't know how else to respond. He grinned, a sudden and disarming burst of joy that made him look like a kid who just discovered his birthday cake. "That's exactly what I thought. It seems fine. But what if it isn't? What if it's secretly awful inside?" I blinked at him, still trying to figure out if this was some kind of elaborate prank. "It's a pineapple," I said slowly. "If it's bad, just don't eat it." He nodded, as if I'd just given him the key to enlightenment. "You're right. Of course. Don't overthink it. Classic mistake." And with that, he tucked the pineapple under his arm, turned, and walked toward the gas station convenience store, leaving me standing there, confused and slightly concerned. I thought that would be the end of it. Just a weird late-night encounter with a guy who had too many feelings about fruit. But as fate would have it, I ran into Ezra again 2 days later, this time at the library. I was in the nonfiction section, trying to find a book on DIY home repairs, when I heard a familiar voice. "You again." I turned and saw him standing at the end of the aisle, holding a stack of books so precariously tall that I was genuinely impressed he hadn't dropped them. "Pineapple guy," I said before I could stop myself. He laughed, loud and unself-conscious, as though I'd just given him the best nickname in the world. "That's me. And you're parking lot sage." "That's not a thing," I said. "It is now," he replied, carefully setting his stack of books on the nearest table. "What are you doing here?" "Looking for a book," I said, gesturing vaguely at the shelves. "What about you?" "Research," he said, pulling out a notebook from his jacket pocket and flipping it open to a page filled with chaotic handwriting and what looked like tiny doodles of pineapples. "I'm writing something." "What kind of something?" "A manifesto." That caught me off guard. "A manifesto? About what?" He hesitated, then grinned sheepishly. "Pineapples, mostly, and fruit, and, the general state of things." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, but it never came. "You're writing a fruit manifesto?" "Exactly," he said, like this was the most reasonable thing in the world. "Why?" "Why not?" he countered, shrugging. There was something so earnest about the way he said it that I couldn't even argue. Instead, I found myself sitting down at the table across from him, listening as he launched into an impassioned explanation about the symbolism of fruit. "Think about it," he said, gesturing wildly with his hands. "Fruit is this universal thing, right? Everyone eats it. It's ancient. It's everywhere. And yet no one really thinks about it. It's just there, in the background, quietly holding society together. I'm pretty sure society would survive without pineapples," I said, though I was starting to doubt myself. "Maybe," he conceded, "but it wouldn't be as fun." Over the next hour, I learned more about fruit than I ever thought possible. Ezra explained the history of bananas, the cultural significance of apples, and the shocking truth about watermelons. Apparently, they used to be bitter and full of seeds before humans started messing with them. At some point, I realized I wasn't even looking for my book anymore. I was just sitting there, completely caught up in Ezra's chaotic orbit. From that day on, Ezra became a regular part of my life. Or maybe I became a regular part of his. It was hard to tell. He had this way of sweeping you into his world without you even realizing it was happening. One afternoon, he showed up at my apartment unannounced, holding a bag of kiwis and a measuring tape. "I need your help," he said, barging in before I could protest. "With what?" I asked, closing the door behind him. "An experiment," he said, dumping the kiwis onto my kitchen counter. "We're going to measure their fluffiness." "Fluffiness?" "Yes," he said, pulling out a magnifying glass and handing it to me. "It's very important." For the next 2 hours, we meticulously measured and documented the fuzz on each kiwi, as though we were solving a high-stakes mystery. By the end of it, my kitchen looked like a crime scene, and I still had no idea what the point of the experiment was. Ezra, of course, was thrilled. "You're a natural," he said, jotting something down in his notebook. "A natural at what?" "Being curious," he said simply. That was Ezra in a nutshell. He could turn the most random, mundane things into a source of wonder, whether it was kiwis or clouds or the oddly specific shapes of puddles on the sidewalk. He had this uncanny ability to make you see the world the way he did. Strange, beautiful, and endlessly fascinating. One evening, as we sat on a park bench eating popsicles, I asked him why he cared so much about things that most people didn't even notice. He licked his popsicle thoughtfully, then said, "Because the big stuff is too loud. Everyone's always so focused on these massive, world-changing ideas, but they miss the tiny, quiet things that actually make life interesting. Like pineapples, or the way the air smells right before it rains, or the fact that kiwis are basically nature's stress balls." I laughed, even though I knew he was being completely serious. Months later, Ezra's manifesto is still unfinished, and I doubt he'll ever actually finish it. But in a way, that feels right. Ezra doesn't seem like the kind of person who needs an ending. He's all about the middle, the messy, unexpected, wonderful parts that most people overlook. And somehow, without even trying, he's taught me to pay attention to those parts, too. The morning my kitchen sink developed an opinion, I was mid-toast. One slice buttered, the other still in the toaster, and then, out of nowhere, it sighed. Not a faint gurgle, not the usual groan of old pipes, but an honest-to-God sigh. I froze, knife in hand, and stared at the sink. "Really?" it said, its voice low and gravelly, like it had spent a lifetime smoking tiny sink-sized cigarettes. I blinked. "What?" The faucet dripped once, as if to punctuate its exasperation. "You're just going to butter one slice? What kind of half-measure breakfast is that?" For a long moment, I just stood there, trying to convince myself I hadn't heard what I just heard. Talking appliances were the kind of thing that happened in fairy tales or fever dreams, not in a one-bedroom apartment above a nail salon. "Are you talking to me?" I asked finally. "Congratulations," the sink muttered. "You cracked the case." I set the knife down carefully, like I was dealing with a wild animal. "Why are you? How are you?" "Talking," it interrupted. "Yeah, I figured you'd be confused. You people always are." "You people?" "Humans," it said with a wet gurgle. "You think the whole world revolves around you, don't you? Like your appliances don't have lives. Like we're not here, working day in and day out, just trying to do our jobs." I stared at it, utterly baffled. "You're a sink. And you're a guy who eats dry toast," it shot back. "That's not dry," I said defensively. "I buttered the first slice." "With the enthusiasm of a corpse," the sink retorted. I couldn't believe I was arguing with my plumbing, but here I was, standing in my kitchen at 8:14 in the morning, trading insults with a voice coming from my drain. "Okay," I said, taking a deep breath. "Let's just back up a second. You can talk now? Since when?" "Since forever," the sink replied. "You just never noticed. Too busy scrolling through your phone while I deal with your greasy pans and questionable leftovers." "I notice things," I muttered, though even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The sink let out a dry laugh. Sure you do. Like that Tupperware lid stuck under the fridge? You've walked past it 17 times this week. Wait, you can see that? Of course I can see it. I've got eyes everywhere. The toaster, the microwave, the fridge. We all talk. But you wouldn't know that, would you? Because you don't pay attention. This was too much. I sat down at the kitchen table, butter knife still in hand, and tried to process what was happening. So, everything in here is alive? Alive is a strong word, the sink said. We're aware, sentient, and frankly, we're exhausted. Exhausted? Do you have any idea what it's like to be a sink? It asked, its voice rising slightly. You think I like being the dumping ground for your half-eaten yogurt and coffee grounds? I've seen things, man. Unspeakable things. Unspeakable? The spaghetti incident, it said darkly. I winced. I knew exactly what it was talking about. Last week, I'd accidentally dumped an entire pot of overcooked spaghetti into the sink, thinking I could rinse it down the drain. It had clogged immediately, forcing me to spend the better part of an hour elbow deep in starchy water, fishing out soggy noodles. Look, I said, running a hand through my hair. I didn't mean for that to happen. It was an accident. Yeah, well, accidents have consequences, the sink said, dripping menacingly. And you're lucky the garbage disposal didn't quit on the spot. I glanced at the disposal switch on the wall, half expecting it to chime in, but it stayed silent. Fine, I said. I'm sorry. Is that what you want to hear? The sink paused, as if considering my apology. It's a start. Great, I said, standing up. Now, if you don't mind, I have to get to work. Don't forget the toast, the sink said. I turned back to the counter. The second slice had popped up, cold and unbuttered. I buttered it quickly, feeling the sink's judgmental silence pressing down on me, and shoved both slices into my mouth as I grabbed my bag and headed for the door. See you later, buddy, the sink called after me. For the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Did all appliances talk? Was my sink just the beginning? What about my shower? My car? When I got home that evening, the apartment was eerily quiet. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. If maybe I'd just been overtired and my brain had decided to prank me. But as I walked into the kitchen, the sink greeted me with a cheerful, "Welcome back. Your shirt's wrinkled, by the way." "Of course it is," I muttered, tossing my bag onto the table. I didn't know whether to be annoyed or amused. The sink's snarky commentary was starting to feel less like an inconvenience and more like a weird kind of companionship. Over the next few days, I learned more about my kitchen than I ever thought possible. The toaster, as it turned out, was incredibly vain and spent most of its time sulking about being covered in crumbs. The fridge was a worrier, constantly muttering about expiration dates and temperature fluctuations. And the microwave had a surprisingly dark sense of humor, once describing itself as a box of nuclear regret. It was overwhelming at first, but slowly, I adjusted. I started talking back, asking the sink for advice on recipes or debating the merits of paper towels versus sponges. It became normal in a way. Until one night, the sink said something I wasn't prepared for. "You're lonely," it said, its voice softer than usual. I froze, the plate I was rinsing slipping from my hands. "What?" "You heard me," the sink said. "You're lonely. You eat dinner alone. You talk to me more than you talk to actual people, and the last time you had a guest over, they left before dessert." "That's none of your business," I said, my cheeks flushing. "It is when you spend half your life in here," the sink replied. "Look, I'm just saying maybe it's time you put yourself out there. Call that girl you like. Go out with friends. Do something." I wanted to argue, to tell it to mind its own business, but I couldn't, because it was right. The next day, I called Kara, a friend I hadn't seen in months, and invited her over for dinner. As we sat in the kitchen, laughing over burned lasagna and too sweet wine, I thought I heard the sink chuckle softly to itself. "Good job," it said later, when she'd left and the dishes were piled in the sink. "Don't get used to this," I muttered, scrubbing a plate. The sink didn't reply, but I could have sworn the water felt a little warmer, a little kinder, as it ran over my hands. I never thought much about who lived in the house across the street. It was one of those places that seemed to exist in a quiet pocket of reality. Always there, always the same. The paint was faded, the shutters hung crooked, and the porch light burned day and night, but no one ever seemed to come or go. It wasn't abandoned, though. I'd see the curtains move sometimes, or hear the faint creak of a door in the middle of the night. For years, I assumed it was an old recluse, someone who didn't want to be bothered. We all have a neighbor like that, the kind you vaguely acknowledge but never really talk to. But then, one Thursday afternoon, an envelope appeared on my doorstep. It was plain, off-white, sealed with a single piece of yellowing tape. No name, no return address, just a weighty, awkward rectangle sitting on the doormat. I looked around, but the street was empty. The sky hung low and gray, and the only sound was the faint rustle of leaves skittering across the asphalt. I opened the envelope. Inside was a key, old, heavy, with a tarnished brass shine, and with it, a note written in an uneven scrawl. I need your help. Across the street. Midnight. Use the key. I stood there for a long moment, turning the key over in my hand. It felt warm, like it had been sitting in the sun, but the day was cold, and the shadows stretched long. It could have been a prank, a weird joke by some bored kid, but something about the note, the way the words tilted slightly, like they'd been written in a hurry, made it hard to dismiss. I didn't tell anyone. What would I even say? That the creepy house across the street had invited me over like we were old friends? That I was seriously considering going? I spent the rest of the evening trying to focus on anything else, but my eyes kept drifting to the window, to the silhouette of the house against the darkening sky. By the time midnight rolled around, I talked myself into it. Or maybe I talked myself out of being scared. I'm still not sure which. Either way, I was standing on their porch, key in hand, heart thudding in my chest like a slow drumbeat. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped up to the door. Up close, the house looked even older, the wood splintering in places, the windows streaked with grime. The faint smell of damp earth lingered in the air, and the yellow porch light buzzed faintly, casting long, wavering shadows. The key slid into the lock with an unsettling smoothness. The door swung open on silent hinges, revealing a dimly lit hallway that smelled of dust and old wood. "Hello?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the stillness. No answer. The house didn't feel abandoned. There was furniture, a sagging couch, a coffee table stacked with newspapers that looked decades old, but everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, like it hadn't been touched in years. I stepped inside, the door closing softly behind me, and that's when I saw the first one. It was in the corner of the room, perched on a tall wooden stool. At first, I thought it was a mannequin, pale, motionless, dressed in a faded black suit. But as I moved closer, I realized it wasn't plastic. It was wax. A wax figure of a man, meticulously detailed down to the faint wrinkles on his forehead. His hands were folded neatly in his lap, his face frozen in a serene, almost solemn expression. And he wasn't alone. In the next room, there was a woman in a long dress, seated in a rocking chair. Her waxy eyes stared out the window, unblinking, and her hands clutched a small bouquet of dried flowers. Every room I entered had more of them. Men, women, even children, all made of wax, all posed as if caught in the middle of some quiet, unknowable moment. A man reading a book, a child holding a toy plane, a woman standing by a mirror, her hand halfway to her hair. It was eerie, but there was something else, something almost reverent about the way they were placed, like they were meant to be here, like they belonged. I was about to turn back when I noticed a faint glow coming from the far end of the hallway. The light led me to a door, plain, unmarked, slightly ajar. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. Then, taking a deep breath, I pushed it open. The room beyond was unlike the others. It was bright, clean, almost clinical. A long workbench stretched along one wall, covered in jars of wax, tools, and brushes. Shelves lined the room, filled with molds and half-finished figures, their faces featureless and smooth. And in the center of the room, lying on a narrow table, was a man. At least, I thought he was a man. His body was perfectly still, his chest rising and falling in shallow, mechanical breaths. His skin was pale, almost translucent, with a faint sheen that reminded me of melted candle wax. As I stepped closer, his eyes snapped open. I froze. "You came," he said, his voice low and strained. I couldn't speak. He sat up slowly, his movements stiff and unnatural, like a puppet being guided by invisible strings. "Thank you," he said. "I didn't think anyone would. What is this place?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the shelves of molds and tools. "A workshop," he said. "A sanctuary. A prison. I don't understand." He smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You will." Before I could say anything else, he reached for something on the table. A small glass vial filled with a shimmering, golden liquid. "This," he said, holding it up to the light, "is what's left of me. My memories. My life. My humanity." I stared at the vial, my mind racing. "What are you talking about?" "I've been here too long," he said. "I thought I could keep it all, the art, the life, the people I loved. But the wax, it takes more than it gives." He handed me the vial, his hand trembling. "You have to leave. Take this with you. Take it far away from here." I hesitated, the weight of the vial heavy in my palm. "What happens if I don't?" He didn't answer. Instead, he lay back down on the table, his eyes closing as his body stiffened, hardening into wax before my eyes. The glow in the room dimmed, the walls seeming to press closer. I ran. The house was silent as I stumbled back through the hallway, past the wax figures frozen in their quiet, unknowable poses. When I reached the front door, I didn't look back. I don't know what was in that vial. I don't know who or what that man was, or why he chose me to take it. But sometimes, late at night, I feel the weight of it in my pocket and I wonder, what happens when the wax comes looking for what it lost? The door at the end of my hallway wasn't supposed to be there. I was sure of it. I've lived in this apartment for 3 years, and my hallway ends at a blank wall. That's how it's always been. Plain, boring beige. But tonight, when I got home, there was a door. It wasn't even a normal door. It was old, ancient-looking, made of dark, weathered wood with iron bands running across it. The handle was a brass ring, tarnished and green with age, and above the door, carved into the wood in jagged, uneven letters, were the words, "Do not enter." I stared at it for a long time, my grocery bags cutting into my hands. My first thought was that the building management was doing some kind of weird renovation, but that didn't make sense. Why would they put a random door at the end of the hallway and not tell anyone? And why the ominous warning? I walked closer, setting my groceries down by my apartment door, and reached out to touch the wood. It felt cold, colder than it should have been, and rough under my fingers. I gave the brass ring a tentative tug, but the door didn't budge. It was locked. That should have been the end of it. I should have gone inside, eaten my dinner, and gone to bed. But I couldn't stop staring at the door. There was something about it, something that made my chest feel tight and my palms sweat. It didn't belong there. And yet, it felt like it had been waiting for me. I went inside and tried to distract myself. I turned on the TV, microwaved a frozen dinner, scrolled mindlessly through my phone, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the door. What was behind it? Why had it appeared now? And why couldn't I shake the feeling that it wanted me to open it? By midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight, a pair of scissors, because, let's be honest, I don't own a proper weapon, and stepped back into the hallway. The door was still there, looming at the end like a shadow that refused to disappear. I stood in front of it, heart pounding, and raised my hand to knock. My knuckles had barely brushed the wood when the door swung open. There was no creak, no dramatic gust of wind, no ominous groan. It just opened, as if it had been waiting for me to make up my mind. Beyond the door was darkness. Not just darkness, but an absence of light, so complete it felt like I was staring into the void. I hesitated, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and then I stepped through. The moment I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, grabbing for the handle, but there was nothing there. No door, no wall, just the same endless blackness in every direction. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in a way that didn't make sense. It didn't fade gradually like a normal echo. It bounced back immediately, sharp and distorted, like something was mimicking me. "Hello," the echo replied, but it wasn't my voice anymore. It was deeper, colder, with an edge of something that sounded almost amused. I shined my flashlight into the void, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. It lit up small patches of ground, if you could call it that, beneath my feet. The surface was smooth and gray, like polished stone, and stretched endlessly into the black. I took a step forward, then another. The echo of my footsteps sounded wrong, louder than they should have been, as if the ground itself was amplifying the sound. "Who's there?" I asked, gripping the flashlight tighter. There was no answer, but I felt it, a presence, just beyond the edge of the light. It wasn't moving, wasn't making a sound, but I knew it was there, watching me. "Show yourself," I demanded, though my voice wavered. The light flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw it. A figure, tall and thin, with limbs that were too long and a head that was just slightly the wrong shape. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, if you could call them that, were dark voids that seemed to drink in the light. It was gone before I could process what I'd seen, melting back into the shadows like smoke. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Do you know where you are?" the voice from before replied. It wasn't an echo anymore. It was closer, clearer, but still wrong. "No," I said, my breath coming in short gasps. "Where am I?" "You are between," it said. "Between what?" "Everything." I didn't understand. None of this made sense. Why am I here? "You opened the door," it said simply, as if that was explanation enough. I didn't. I started, but then I stopped. I had opened the door. I'd been the one who couldn't leave well enough alone. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "To choose," it replied. "Choose what?" The figure appeared again, just at the edge of the light. This time, it didn't vanish. It stepped closer, and I could see now that it wasn't entirely solid. Its edges flickered, shifting like static on a broken TV screen. "There are paths," it said, its voice resonating in my bones. "One forward, one back, one that leads nowhere." I swallowed hard, the flashlight shaking in my grip. "I don't understand." "You will," it said, and then the ground beneath me shifted. I staggered, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as the polished stone began to split into 3 narrow paths. One led straight ahead, vanishing into the darkness. Another curved to the left, its surface rough and uneven. The third was jagged, broken, with deep cracks running through it like scars. "Choose," the figure said again, standing motionless between the paths. I hesitated, my mind racing. What happens if I choose the wrong one? "There is no wrong choice," it said, though something in its tone made me doubt that was true. I stared at the paths, my chest tight. The smooth path seemed safest, but it felt too obvious, too easy. The rough path looked treacherous, but it had an odd sense of purpose, as if it led somewhere important. The broken path, though, it looked like it might fall apart beneath my feet. "What's at the end of these?" I asked, but the figure didn't answer. The silence pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and stepped onto the rough path. The moment my foot touched it, the other paths disappeared. The figure melted into the shadows, and the darkness around me shifted, swirling like a storm. I don't know where the path leads. I don't know if I'll ever find my way back. But as I walk, the echo of my footsteps no longer sounds like my own. The house at the end of Ransom Lane wasn't abandoned, though everyone in the neighborhood liked to say it was. The curtains were always drawn, and the yard was overgrown with weeds that towered taller than a person. The roof sagged in places, and one of the upstairs windows had a crack running across it like a jagged scar. But at night, if you stood in just the right spot on the sidewalk and squinted, you could see the faint glow of a light inside. I was 11 the first time I noticed the light. My friends and I were playing one of those summer games that kids invent when there's nothing better to do. Running around the neighborhood, daring each other to ring doorbells or climb fences. When we got to the end of the street, someone pointed at the house and said, "Bet you won't go knock?" We all laughed, but nobody stepped forward. Not even Tom, who had a reputation for being fearless. "That place is haunted," he said, his voice low and serious, like he wanted us to believe it. "Haunted by what?" I asked, though my stomach was already twisting. "An old man," said Katie. "They say he still lives there, even though he's dead. My brother saw him once. He says he only comes out at night." I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't help glancing at the house. It looked the same as always, its dark shape looming at the end of the cul-de-sac, half hidden by the wild tangle of trees and bushes that surrounded it. "I dare you to go touch the porch," Tom said, grinning at me. I wanted to say no. My gut told me to say no, but I didn't want to look scared. Not in front of everyone. So I shoved my hands in my pockets and walked toward the house, my steps slow and deliberate. The others stayed behind, their voices dropping into whispers as I got closer. The air felt different as I approached the house. Heavier, colder, even though it was the middle of July. The grass was damp under my sneakers, and the smell of mildew and earth grew stronger with each step. When I reached the edge of the porch, I hesitated. The wood was warped and rotting, the paint peeling away in long, jagged strips. The front door was closed, its surface scratched and scarred, like someone had been clawing at it. I told myself it was just an old house. There was nothing to be afraid of. Then I saw the light. It was faint, flickering, like a candle burning behind the curtains of the upstairs window. I stared at it, my chest tightening, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move, a shadow passing in front of the glow. I ran back to my friends without touching the porch. That night, I dreamed about the house. In the dream, I was standing in the front yard, staring up at the cracked window. The light was brighter now, casting long, flickering shadows across the yard. The front door creaked open, slowly, and I felt something watching me from the darkness inside. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. And then the shadow stepped out. I woke up gasping, my heart hammering in my chest. For weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about the house. I asked my mom about it once, casually, as we were driving past. She glanced at it briefly, then shook her head. "Nothing to know," she said. "That place has been empty for years." But I didn't believe her. One afternoon, I walked past the house on my way home from school. I told myself I wasn't looking for anything, just taking the long way back. But as I passed the driveway, I felt it again, that strange, heavy sensation, like the air was thicker near the house. The curtains in the downstairs window shifted. I froze, my backpack digging into my shoulders. For a second, I thought I saw a hand, a pale, thin hand, pulling the curtain back. But when I blinked, it was gone. I didn't tell anyone. Not Tom, not Katie, not my mom. I wasn't even sure I'd really seen it, but I kept going back. Every few days, I'd find an excuse to walk past the house. Sometimes, I'd see the faint glow of the light upstairs. Other times, I'd catch the briefest flicker of movement behind the curtains. It was never enough to be certain, just enough to keep me wondering. Then, one evening in late August, I saw the door was open. It was just a crack, barely noticeable, but it stopped me in my tracks. The warm evening air suddenly felt colder, and the sounds of the neighborhood, kids laughing, a dog barking, faded into the background. I don't know what possessed me to walk up the driveway. The grass brushed against my legs as I stepped onto the porch, my hands trembling at my sides. The open door loomed in front of me, the darkness inside impossibly deep. I leaned forward, peering into the gap, and called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I heard it, a faint, shuffling noise, like footsteps on a wooden floor. "Hello?" I said again, my heart pounding. The shuffling stopped, and then, slowly, the door creaked open wider. I should have run. I knew I should have run, but something drew me forward, pulling me toward the threshold. Inside, the house was dark and still, the air thick with the smell of dust and something faintly sweet, like rotting flowers. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. "Is anyone here?" I whispered. The light flickered on. It wasn't the upstairs light I'd seen before. This one came from the hallway just ahead, spilling out from an open doorway. It was warm, golden, inviting in a way that made my stomach twist. I stepped closer, my shoes scraping against the wood. The door at the end of the hallway was slightly ajar, the light spilling out in a soft arc. I reached out, my fingers brushing the edge of the doorframe, and pushed it open. The room beyond wasn't what I expected. It was small and sparse, with a single chair sitting in the center. On the floor in front of the chair was a mirror, propped up at an angle so it reflected the doorway. My own face stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed, framed by the dim light of the hallway. And then, in the mirror, I saw something move behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the chair was no longer empty. A man sat there, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and hollow. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the mirror, at my reflection. I don't remember running home. I don't remember slamming the door behind me or crawling under the covers, my heart racing so fast I thought it might burst. I never went back to the house. But sometimes, when I walk past that end of the street, I swear I can see someone standing in the upstairs window, watching me. And I know better than to look too long. There's a diner off Route 46 that only opens after midnight. It doesn't have a name. The sign above the door just says EATS in faded red letters, and one of the bulbs in the neon outline flickers like it's about to go out. If you pass it during the day, it looks like every other roadside dive. A cracked parking lot, a squat brick building, a half-rusted dumpster around back. But no matter how many times you drive by, you'll never see it open. I'd been hearing about it for years. People around town like to tell stories about the midnight diner, how you could find it glowing in the dark like a firefly once the sun went down, how it didn't matter where you started. If you were looking for it, you'd always find it, like the road bent itself around you. I never put much stock in the rumors. People talked about it the way they talked about ghost stories or urban legends, half believing, half entertaining themselves. Some said the food was the best they'd ever had, like the cook knew exactly what you needed before you even ordered. Others said the diner wasn't about the food at all, that it was more like a place between places where you could ask for things you couldn't get anywhere else. I never believed it, until the night I found it. I was driving back from a late shift, the kind that leaves you hollowed out and sticky with exhaustion. The road stretched endlessly in front of me, the trees on either side pressing in like shadows. My radio was broken, the silence in the car oppressive, and I was halfway through a cup of gas station coffee that tasted like burnt paper when I saw the glow. At first, I thought it was just another rest stop, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't anywhere I'd seen before. The flickering neon sign caught my eye, and without thinking, I slowed down. The parking lot was empty, except for a single car. A boxy, old sedan with peeling paint and a bumper sticker I couldn't read in the dark. The diner itself looked almost too clean, like someone had scrubbed the windows and wiped down the chrome recently. I should have kept driving, but something about the light, the hum of the sign, the faint smell of coffee and bacon wafting through the air, it pulled me in. The bell above the door jingled softly as I stepped inside. The place was smaller than I'd expected, just a handful of booths and a counter with a row of red vinyl stools. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of grease and syrup. There was no music playing, just the low hum of the fluorescent lights. Behind the counter stood a man in a white apron, his hair slicked back like he'd stepped out of a black and white movie. He didn't look surprised to see me. "Sit anywhere you like," he said, his voice calm and easy. I hesitated, my hand still on the door. "You guys open late, huh?" "We're always open," he replied, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. I picked a booth near the window, the vinyl seat squeaking slightly as I slid in. The menu was already on the table, a laminated sheet with no prices, just a list of dishes: pancakes, eggs, burgers, pie. Simple stuff. The man behind the counter didn't come over to take my order. Instead, he poured a cup of coffee and set it on the counter, then nodded toward me. "For you," he said. "I didn't order anything yet," I said, but he just smiled. "You will." I got up, walked over, and took the cup. The coffee was hot, strong, with just a hint of sweetness. It wasn't what I'd usually drink, but somehow, it was exactly what I needed. How do you know what people want? I asked, more curious than suspicious. He shrugged. I pay attention. As I drank, I looked around the diner. At first glance, it seemed empty, but then I noticed a figure sitting at the farthest booth, tucked into the shadows. A woman, her hair falling over her face, stirring something in a mug. She wasn't eating. She wasn't even looking up. I glanced at the man behind the counter, but he didn't seem to notice her, or maybe he just didn't care. Busy night? I asked, nodding toward the woman. He looked over his shoulder, his expression unchanged. It's not about how many come in, he said. It's about who. I didn't know what that meant, and I didn't ask. I ordered a slice of pie, apple warm, with a scoop of vanilla ice cream on top, and ate slowly, the clock above the counter ticking softly in the quiet. The woman in the corner never moved. When I finished, the man came over with a pot of coffee, refilling my cup without asking. First time here? Yeah, I said. Didn't even know this place existed. His smile widened slightly, like he'd heard that 1,000 times. Most don't. Not until they need to. Need to? He leaned on the counter, looking at me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. You don't end up here by accident. You came for something. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. I just wanted coffee and pie. Is that all? The question hung in the air, heavier than it should have been. I looked away, suddenly feeling exposed, like he could see straight through me. What is this place? I asked, my voice quieter now. It's a diner, he said simply. No, I said, my throat dry. It's not. He straightened, picking up my empty plate and setting it on the counter. Finish your coffee, he said. Then decide. Decide what? But he didn't answer. The woman in the corner finally moved. She stood slowly, her figure slender and almost unreal in the dim light. She didn't look at me as she walked past, her footsteps silent on the tiled floor. As she reached the door, she paused, glancing back at the man behind the counter. Thank you, she said softly, her voice tinged with something I couldn't place. He nodded once, and she stepped outside. I turned back to him, my heart racing. What did she thank you for? He smiled again, but this time, it didn't reach his eyes. Some people come here to leave something behind, he said. Others come to take something with them. What about me? That's up to you. The bell jingled softly as the door swung shut behind her. When I looked out the window, she was gone. I didn't stay long after that. I left a 20 on the table. There was no check, but it felt wrong to leave without paying, and walked out into the cool night air. When I turned to look back at the diner, it was dark. The neon sign was off, the windows black. The parking lot was empty, not even my car where I'd left it. I walked back to the road, the faint hum of the highway in the distance, and kept walking until I found a gas station where a bored clerk let me use the phone to call a friend. I haven't been able to find the diner again. I've driven up and down Route 46 more times than I can count, but there's no trace of it, not even the flicker of the old neon sign. Sometimes, though, I think about what the man said. You don't end up here by accident, and I wonder what it was I left behind, or what I might have taken with me. The house had a door it didn't need. When I first saw it, I thought it was some odd design quirk, the kind of thing you find in old homes where the architecture outlasted practicality. It was tucked into the back of the kitchen, narrow and plain, with a peeling brass knob that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. But the strangest thing was its location. The house was built into a hill, and the kitchen sat against the slope. Behind that wall was nothing but packed dirt and stone. I knew this because the real estate agent had told me as much during the walkthrough, rattling off the house's quirks with a practiced cheerfulness that bordered on rehearsed. It's charming, don't you think? She'd said, gesturing vaguely at the crooked windows and uneven floors. I didn't think much of the door at first. I was more focused on the fact that the place was within my budget, a miracle in itself, and seemed structurally sound, despite its eccentricities. The price was suspiciously low, of course, but the agent chalked it up to the location being off the beaten path. That part was true. The house sat at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by dense woods, so far from town that the closest neighbors were deer and foxes. It was quiet, secluded, exactly what I thought I needed after leaving the city. I moved in on a warm afternoon in late spring. The house smelled of old wood and damp plaster, but it wasn't unpleasant. It felt lived in, though the previous owners had long since disappeared from the records. A local handyman named Tom helped me unload the boxes, making small talk as we carried my mismatched furniture inside. "You'll like it here," he said, setting a chair down in the living room. "It's peaceful. Folks around here don't bother each other much." He didn't look at me when he said it, his eyes drifting toward the kitchen, where the strange door sat half hidden in the shadow of the cabinets. I wanted to ask him if he knew anything about it, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I offered him a beer when we finished unloading, and he declined with a polite shake of his head, muttering something about an early morning before driving off in his rusted pickup. That first night, I dreamed of the door. In the dream, I was standing in the kitchen, barefoot on the cold tile, staring at it. The brass knob was smooth under my hand, the metal warm, almost pulsing. When I turned it, the door swung inward without resistance, revealing not dirt or stone, but a long, dark hallway that stretched farther than the boundaries of the house should have allowed. The walls were bare, the floor uneven, and the air that spilled out was damp and sharp, like the smell of wet leaves after a storm. I woke with a start, my heart racing, and sat up in bed, listening to the silence of the house. It was so quiet it felt unnatural, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums until you start imagining faint noises just to fill the void. I told myself it was just a dream, one born from exhaustion and stress. But when I walked into the kitchen the next morning, I found myself staring at the door again, my hand brushing against the knob before I even realized I was reaching for it. It didn't open. I turned the knob, but it didn't budge. I pushed against it, then pulled, but it remained stubbornly closed, as though it had been sealed shut from the other side. For a moment, I thought about getting a crowbar or calling Tom to ask if he had any tools I could borrow, but something about the door made me hesitate. It wasn't just its stubbornness. It was the way the air seemed to thicken the closer I got to it, as though the space around it was somehow heavier. By the end of the week, I had almost forgotten about it. I threw myself into unpacking, rearranging furniture, and exploring the surrounding woods. The house began to feel less like a stranger and more like mine, its creaks and groans becoming familiar, its peculiar layout charming in a way I hadn't expected. But the door was always there, sitting in the corner of my awareness like a splinter I couldn't reach. On the seventh night, the dreams came back. This time, I wasn't alone in the hallway. The figure was faint at first, little more than a shadow at the edge of the darkness. But as I stepped closer, its shape became clearer. A tall, thin silhouette with sharp angles that didn't quite make sense, as though it had been drawn by someone who didn't understand how human bodies were supposed to work. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its attention, sharp and heavy, like the weight of 100 unseen eyes pressing against my skin. I woke gasping, drenched in sweat, and when I stumbled into the kitchen for a glass of water, I found the door slightly ajar. I stopped in the doorway, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The door hadn't been open when I went to bed. I was sure of it. But there it was, the gap narrow but unmistakable, blackness spilling out like ink into the dim light of the kitchen. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. There was no answer, just the faint creak of the hinges as the door shifted slightly, as though nudged by a breeze I couldn't feel. Against every instinct screaming at me to turn around, I stepped closer, my bare feet silent against the tile. The air was colder near the door, carrying that same damp, sharp smell from my dream. I pushed the door open wider, the hinges groaning in protest, and saw the hallway again, stretching impossibly far into the dark. The walls were rough, uneven, and the floor sloped downward, disappearing into shadow. I reached out to touch the frame, half expecting my hand to meet the solid resistance of the hill behind the house, but the space was real, tangible, and then I heard it, a faint sound, almost imperceptible, drifting up from the depths of the hallway. It wasn't a voice, exactly. more like a whisper, layered and overlapping. 100 faint murmurs blending together into something that sounded just shy of human. My stomach twisted, and I stepped back, slamming the door shut with a force that made the walls shudder. The whispering stopped. For the rest of the night, I sat in the living room with every light in the house turned on, clutching a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. I didn't sleep. By morning, the door was locked again, as though it had never been opened. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing, that I'd been half asleep, dreaming with my eyes open, but deep down, I knew better. I don't go near the door anymore. I've thought about moving, about packing up and leaving the house to rot, but something about it keeps me here, something I can't quite explain. Sometimes, at night, I hear the faint creak of hinges or the soft murmur of voices I can't understand. And sometimes, when I walk into the kitchen in the morning, I find the door open just a crack, as if it's waiting for me to step through. The first thing I noticed about the laundromat was that the clock on the wall didn't move. It was an old, oversized clock with Roman numerals instead of numbers, its hands stuck at 2:17. The second hand twitched back and forth, as though it were trying to decide if it should keep going or just give up entirely. The laundromat itself was dimly lit, with flickering fluorescent lights and a faint chemical smell that clung to everything. I wouldn't have been there at all if my washer hadn't decided to die that morning, leaving me with a pile of damp, half-washed clothes and nowhere else to go. My neighborhood laundromat was a block away, sandwiched between a pawn shop and a bodega, its neon, open 24 hours, sign buzzing faintly in the evening air. It was empty when I walked in. No employees, no customers, just rows of ancient washers and dryers humming softly to themselves. The vending machine in the corner had a single bag of chips stuck in the coils, and the plastic chairs lining the wall looked like they'd been dragged out of a high school cafeteria. I picked a washer at random, dumped my clothes inside, and fed it a handful of quarters. As the machine rumbled to life, I sat down in one of the chairs and stared at my phone, scrolling aimlessly through emails I didn't care about. That's when I noticed the man. He was sitting at the far end of the laundromat, hunched over a small notebook, his pen moving furiously across the page. He looked to be in his 60s, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses that caught the flickering light every time he shifted. He was dressed like he'd been plucked out of a different era, tweed jacket, pocket square, leather shoes polished to a mirror shine. I hadn't heard him come in. At first, I didn't pay him much attention. People write in laundromats all the time, don't they? It's a boring place. You've got to pass the time somehow. But the more I watched him out of the corner of my eye, the stranger he seemed. His pen never stopped moving, his hand flying across the page as though he were racing against an invisible deadline. And he wasn't writing casually, the way you jot down a grocery list or a random idea. He was writing with purpose, his brow furrowed, his mouth set in a grim line. I tried to focus on my phone, but my curiosity got the better of me. I glanced up again, and this time, he was staring right at me. "Do you know what time it is?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. For some reason, the question caught me off guard. I think it's around 7? The man glanced at the clock on the wall, the one stuck at 2:17, and gave a small, humorless smile. "It's always 7, isn't it?" I didn't know how to respond to that. The man set his notebook down on the bench beside him and stood, smoothing out his jacket. He walked over to me, his shoes clicking softly against the tile floor, and stopped a few feet away. "You're new here," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I guess," I replied, unsure of what he meant. "First time at this laundromat." He nodded, as though I'd confirmed something for him. "Do you have a watch?" I blinked. "A watch?" "Yes," he said, tilting his head slightly. "Do you have one?" I pulled out my phone. "I have my phone." The man's expression darkened. No, that won't do," he said, almost to himself. "Phones lie. Watches are honest." "Okay," I said slowly, starting to regret making eye contact with him. "Well, I don't wear a watch, so—" He interrupted me by reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out an old, silver pocket watch. He held it out to me, the chain dangling between his fingers like a spider's thread. "Take it," he said. "What?" "No, I'm good," I said, holding up my hands. "It's not a gift," he said sharply. "It's a loan." I hesitated. There was something about the way he was looking at me, intense, almost desperate, that made it hard to say no. Against my better judgment, I reached out and took the watch. It was surprisingly heavy, the metal cool against my palm. The face of the watch was plain, with slender black hands and no numbers, just faint tick marks around the edge. The second hand ticked steadily, marking time in a way that felt both precise and inevitable. "What am I supposed to do with this?" I asked. The man didn't answer. Instead, he leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper. "When the clock on the wall moves, leave. Don't look back." I stared at him, trying to figure out if he was joking, but his expression was dead serious. Before I could ask him what he meant, he turned and walked out of the laundromat, his notebook forgotten on the bench. I sat there for a long time, holding the watch and staring at the clock on the wall. 2:17. The second hand twitched, but the time didn't change. My washer beeped, snapping me out of my thoughts. I shoved my wet clothes into a dryer and started the cycle, trying to shake off the weirdness of the interaction. But the pocket watch felt heavy in my pocket, like it was anchoring me to something I couldn't see. As the dryer hummed, I noticed the notebook the man had left behind. Curiosity tugged at me again, and I picked it up, flipping through the pages. It was full of numbers. Rows and rows of numbers, written in small, precise handwriting. Dates, times, coordinates, nothing that made any sense to me. On the last page, there was a single sentence, written in bold letters. "Don't stay past 2:17. A chill ran down my spine. I glanced at the clock on the wall. Still 2:17. I told myself it was a coincidence. Some eccentric old guy messing with me for fun. But the longer I sat there, the heavier the air felt, like the room was holding its breath. The dryer buzzed, signaling the end of the cycle. I grabbed my clothes, stuffing them haphazardly into a bag, and glanced at the clock one last time. The minute hand had moved. 2:18. My chest tightened. The lights flickered, and for a moment, I thought I heard something, a faint whisper, like 100 voices murmuring just out of earshot. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I bolted for the door, the pocket watch clutched tightly in my hand. As I stepped outside, the air felt lighter, the world sharper, as though I'd crossed an invisible barrier. When I looked back, the laundromat was dark. The neon, "Open 24 hours" sign was off, and the windows were pitch black, reflecting nothing but my own pale face. I still have the pocket watch. It ticked steadily, always keeping perfect time. I don't know who the man was, or what would have happened if I'd stayed. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint hum of a dryer and the whisper of voices, and I wonder if the laundromat is still waiting for me to come back. Would you? The train was late, which wasn't unusual, but the silence at the platform was. No announcements crackled over the speakers, no hurried footsteps tapped along the concrete. Just the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint echo of something distant, a sound too faint to name. Maddie glanced at her phone. No signal. The time had frozen at 7:14, though her watch insisted it was nearing 7:30. She looked around. The station was empty, save for a few other passengers standing stiffly in the shadows, their faces turned toward the tracks. She considered leaving. The walk home wasn't long, and the quiet gnawed at her in a way she didn't like. But just as she shifted her weight, ready to turn back toward the stairs, the train arrived. It pulled into the station without fanfare, slowing with a precision that felt off. The cars were old, their windows dark, the steel sides marred by rust and grime. The doors hissed open, and the interior lights flickered weakly, revealing rows of worn leather seats. No one got off. Maddie hesitated. The others on the platform moved wordlessly toward the train, their steps mechanical. The sight of them unsettled her. Something about the way they moved didn't feel entirely human. She thought about letting the train leave without her, but her apartment was cold and empty, and the prospect of another walk through the city's shadowed streets felt worse. So she stepped on. The doors closed behind her with a low groan. She found a seat near the middle of the car, her reflection faintly visible in the window beside her. The train smelled faintly of damp metal, the kind of smell that lingered in basements and forgotten places. No one spoke. The passengers she'd seen on the platform had taken their seats near the front, their faces obscured. She was alone in her section of the car, the hum of the train filling the silence. The train jerked into motion, and Maddie glanced out the window. The platform slid away, replaced by darkness. No lights marked the tunnels, no graffiti marred the concrete walls. The city should have been visible by now, flickering past in a blur of neon and shadow, but there was only blackness. The train picked up speed. Maddie pulled her coat tighter around herself, suddenly aware of the cold. Her breath fogged the air, and the hairs on the back of her neck prickled. The other passengers didn't seem to notice or care. They sat motionless, their heads tilted slightly, as though listening to something she couldn't hear. "Excuse me," she called, her voice breaking the silence. "Is this train going to Market Street?" No one answered. Her words seemed to die in the air, swallowed by the relentless hum of the train. She stood and walked toward the front of the car, her footsteps echoing softly. "Excuse me," she said again, louder this time. The passengers didn't turn. They didn't move at all. Maddie leaned closer to one of them, a woman in a gray coat. Her face was turned toward the window, her features pale and unnervingly smooth, like a porcelain mask. Maddie stepped back, her pulse quickening. Something moved at the far end of the car. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light. It was tall, its posture too straight, its presence wrong in a way Maddie couldn't explain. It stepped forward, slow and deliberate, its movements fluid but not natural. The air seemed heavier now, the hum of the train louder, vibrating in her chest. She backed away, retreating toward her seat. The figure stopped in the center of the car, its face still obscured by shadow. It tilted its head, as though studying her, and then it spoke. Its voice was low and smooth, each word precise. "You're not supposed to be here." The words hit her like a blow, cold and final. Maddie opened her mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Her breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped closer. "This is not your place," it said, its tone unchanging. "Why did you get on?" I didn't know," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I thought it was just a train." The figure paused, as though considering her answer. "It isn't." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The lights flickered, plunging the car into brief darkness. When they came back, the other passengers were gone. The seats were empty, their leather worn and cracked, as though they hadn't been used in decades. The figure was still there, its presence consuming the space. "What do you mean?" Maddie asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Where am I?" The figure raised a hand, its fingers impossibly long. It pointed toward the window. Maddie turned, and for the first time, she saw something beyond the glass. Shapes moved in the darkness, indistinct, shifting, massive. The train wasn't in a tunnel anymore. It was traveling through something vast and endless, a place that felt alive in the way deep forests or oceans do, but infinitely more alien. "This is a path," the figure said, its voice like the creak of ancient wood. "A place between places. It is not meant for you." "I didn't mean to come here," Maddie said, her hands trembling. "I just got on the train." The figure tilted its head again. "The choice is made. You cannot leave until the journey is done." The train shuddered, the lights dimming again. The shapes outside the window grew closer, their edges sharper now. Maddie could see hints of texture, movement. Things that weren't entirely solid, their forms shifting between shapes her mind couldn't hold on to. The hum of the train grew louder, drowning out her thoughts. "Where does it go?" she asked, desperation creeping into her voice. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped back, retreating into the shadows at the far end of the car. The lights flickered, and when they steadied, it was gone. Maddie sat down, her hands gripping the edge of the seat. The train raced onward, the shapes outside pressing closer, their presence suffocating. She thought of the platform, the quiet street, the moment she'd chosen to step aboard. It felt like a lifetime ago. The train began to slow. The hum softened, replaced by a low, rhythmic grinding. Maddie pressed her face to the window, her breath fogging the glass. Ahead, A faint light broke the darkness, growing brighter as the train approached. She couldn't make out what lay beyond it, but the light was warm, golden, and for a moment, it felt like hope. The train came to a stop. The doors hissed open, revealing a place that wasn't the city, wasn't a station, wasn't anywhere she had ever imagined. Maddie hesitated, her heart pounding. The key lay in stepping off, but she didn't know if she was meant to stay. The light pulsed, beckoning, and the choice became hers alone. The postcard arrived on a Thursday, wedged between a credit card offer and a flyer for pizza delivery. It was strange for two reasons. First, I hadn't gotten a postcard in years, and second, it had no stamp. Just my name, scrawled in a looping, almost hurried handwriting, with no return address and no indication of where it had come from. The picture on the front showed a lighthouse, the kind that juts out against the sky like it's challenging the horizon itself. The colors were muted, faded by time or poor printing. A dull gray sky, churning white waves, a black and white tower with no light in its beacon. It didn't look like any lighthouse I recognized. Not that I could name many lighthouses off the top of my head. I turned it over, expecting a generic message like, "Wish you were here," or "Greetings from the coast." But there was only one sentence, written in the same looping script as my name. "You've been here before." I turned the card over again, staring at the lighthouse. It didn't look familiar. I wasn't much of a traveler, and I'd spent most of my life in landlocked towns where the closest thing to a body of water was a man-made reservoir. And yet, the sentence gnawed at me, tugging at something deep in the back of my mind, like the memory of a dream I couldn't quite piece together. I put the postcard on the kitchen table and tried to forget about it, but it didn't let me. That night, I dreamed of water. It wasn't the serene kind of water you see in vacation brochures. It was dark, endless, a heaving expanse of black that stretched in every direction. I was standing on the deck of a boat, though I couldn't remember how I'd gotten there, or even what the boat looked like. All I could see was the lighthouse in the distance, its silhouette barely visible against the stormy sky. Its light was off. The waves were pulling me closer to it, though I didn't feel afraid. If anything, I felt drawn to it, as if the lighthouse had been waiting for me. When I woke up, my mouth tasted like salt. The postcard was still on the table, right where I'd left it, but now it felt heavier somehow, like it had soaked up the weight of my dream. I picked it up and stared at the lighthouse again, trying to shake the unease curling in my chest. It was just a coincidence, I told myself. A weird, cryptic message from someone who had the wrong address. But when I tried to throw it away, I couldn't bring myself to do it. For the next few days, I carried the postcard with me everywhere. I didn't mean to. It just kept ending up in my bag, in my pocket, on the passenger seat of my car. I'd tell myself I was going to leave it at home, but by the time I walked out the door, it would be there again, like it was following me. The dreams didn't stop, either. Every night, I found myself on that same boat, the waves pulling me closer to the lighthouse. Each time, it felt more vivid, the chill of the wind on my skin, the crash of the waves against the hull, the deep, rhythmic creak of the boat beneath my feet. And each time, the lighthouse was a little closer. By the fifth night, I woke up gasping, the taste of salt water sharp on my tongue. I grabbed my phone and started searching for lighthouses, scrolling through pictures until my eyes blurred. Nothing matched. Some were close, but not close enough. I posted a picture of the postcard online, asking if anyone recognized the lighthouse. The responses were the usual mix of unhelpful guesses and jokes, but one comment stood out. "Looks like the old lighthouse on Blackwater Isle." Blackwater Isle. I'd never heard of it, but the name sent a shiver down my spine. I clicked on the profile of the person who'd commented, but it was blank. No posts, no pictures, no details. Just a username I didn't recognize. A quick search told me Blackwater Isle was a small, uninhabited island off the coast of Maine. It wasn't a place people visited. In fact, most articles about it mentioned that it was closed to the public due to safety concerns. Unstable cliffs, unpredictable tides, the usual warnings that make a place sound more dangerous than it probably is. But as I stared at the grainy satellite images of the island, I felt it again. That pull, that gnawing sense that I needed to go there. I called in sick the next day and booked a flight to Maine. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I couldn't explain it, even to myself. Getting to the island wasn't easy. I rented a car and drove to the closest coastal town, a sleepy fishing village where the air smelled like brine and everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. When I asked about Blackwater Isle, the locals were polite but distant, their answers vague and clipped. "Why'd you want to go out there?" one old fisherman asked, squinting at me over his coffee. "Just curious," I lied. He shook his head. "Nothing there but rocks and ruins. No one's been out there in years." It took some persistence, but I eventually found a boat willing to take me to the island. The captain was a wiry man in his 60s who didn't ask questions, though I could feel his disapproval in the way he avoided looking at me during the ride. The island loomed on the horizon, stark and uninviting. The lighthouse was just as it had been in the postcard. Black and white, its beacon unlit, surrounded by jagged cliffs and crashing waves. As we approached, the boat rocked violently, and the captain muttered something about bad currents. He didn't offer to wait for me. I stepped onto the rocky shore, clutching the postcard like a lifeline. The air was colder here, sharper, and the sound of the waves seemed louder than it should have been. The lighthouse towered above me, its paint peeling and its windows dark. I don't remember climbing the steps. One moment, I was standing at the base of the tower, and the next, I was inside. The sound of the wind muffled by the thick stone walls. The staircase spiraled upward, narrow and steep, and I followed it without hesitation. The postcard crumpled in my hand. At the top, the room was empty except for the light, which stood silent and cold. But the walls were covered in writing. My writing. Every inch of the stone was covered in words, dates, names, fragments of thoughts and memories I didn't recognize but knew were mine. They spiraled around the room, looping and twisting, written in the same hurried, looping script as the postcard. And in the center of the room, propped against the base of the light, was another postcard. This one wasn't blank. It showed a picture of me, standing at the base of a lighthouse. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at it. When I finally left the island, the captain didn't ask any questions. I still have the postcards. I still dream of the lighthouse. And sometimes, when I wake up, I find new writing on the walls of my apartment, looping and twisting in handwriting that looks like mine but doesn't feel like it. You ever feel like you're being called to something, even though you don't know why? Like there's a place waiting for you. A place you've never been but somehow remember? A place you'll never truly leave? When I was 25, I spent a month working as a night guard at a museum no one ever visited. It was called the Blythe Historical Society, though calling it a museum was generous. The building was a crumbling, brick relic that looked like it had been plucked out of an old black and white photograph and abandoned in the present day. Inside, it housed what could only be described as a collection of very specific junk: antique farming tools, faded photographs of long-dead townsfolk, and a single glass case containing what I can only describe as weird stuff. The weird stuff was what made the job tolerable. By day, the Blythe Historical Society was dead. Barely any visitors, no events, no excitement. But at night, alone in the creaky, dimly lit rooms, the weird stuff became fascinating. There was a tattered leather diary from the 1800s, written in a language no one had identified. A tin box filled with what looked like human teeth, though no one knew whose. A carved wooden idol that the museum placard simply described as origin unknown and possibly cursed. And my personal favorite, a long, black key with no discernible purpose, locked in its own glass case in the center of the exhibit. Its label read, "The Key to Nothing." That was it. No backstory, no explanation, just the key to nothing. The job itself wasn't complicated. I was supposed to walk the halls every hour, check that nothing was broken or stolen, not that anyone was breaking in to steal a plow from 1873, and fill out a log sheet for my boss, a woman named Susan who looked permanently exhausted. She'd hired me with almost no questions, probably because no one else wanted the job. The pay was decent, though, and I figured it would give me time to work on my grad school applications during the long, empty hours. But what I hadn't anticipated was how alive the building would feel at night. The first week wasn't too bad. Sure, the museum creaked and groaned in ways I couldn't always explain. But that was just an old building doing old building things. The shadows in the corners were just tricks of the light, and the faint scratching noises in the walls were probably mice. But by the second week, things started to get strange. It started with the lights. The overhead lights in the gallery were supposed to stay on all night for security purposes, but more than once, I'd find one of them flickering. Not just a random bulb. It was always the light above the key to nothing. I'd call maintenance, they'd check it out, and every time they'd tell me the same thing: there's nothing wrong with the wiring. Then there were the sounds. They didn't happen every night, but often enough that I couldn't ignore them. Faint footsteps in the halls when I was the only one there, the sound of something heavy shifting in one of the storage rooms, and, on one particularly bad night, a low humming noise that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. I searched the entire museum for the source, but by the time I reached the exhibit with the weird stuff, it had stopped. And then, of course, there was the key. I don't know when I started noticing it. At first, it was just there, locked in its case like everything else. But the more I walked past it, the more it seemed to pull at me. It wasn't just the label, the key to nothing, though that certainly didn't help. It was the way it seemed to shimmer under the glass, even in the dim light, as if it were coated in some faint, otherworldly glow. I'd catch myself staring at it for longer than I intended, my hand brushing against the glass like I wanted to touch it. It made no sense. It was just a key, but it felt like it was waiting for something. One night, about 3 weeks into the job, I made a mistake. I just finished my usual rounds and was sitting at the security desk, flipping through my phone and trying to ignore the faint sound of footsteps coming from the gallery. The footsteps weren't unusual at this point. I'd learned to tune them out. But then, for reasons I still can't explain, I looked up at the security monitor. The screen showed the exhibit with the weird stuff, lit by the flickering overhead light. And there, standing in front of the glass case with the key, was a man. Or at least, I think it was a man. The figure was tall and thin, with shoulders that seemed slightly too sharp and limbs that were too long. He, or it, wasn't moving, just standing perfectly still, staring down at the key. I couldn't see his face. His back was to the camera. I froze. No one was supposed to be in the museum but me. My first thought was that someone had broken in. But how? The alarms hadn't gone off, and the front door was locked. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the gallery, my heart pounding in my chest. When I got there, the room was empty. No man, no footsteps, nothing but the faint hum of the air conditioning and the flickering light above the key. But something was different. The glass case that held the key was fogged up, as if someone had pressed their face against it and breathed. The key itself seemed brighter, more vivid, like it was glowing faintly in the dark. I backed out of the room and spent the rest of the night at the security desk, staring at the monitor and waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. When Susan came in the next morning, I told her what I'd seen, or tried to, anyway. She just gave me a tight-lipped smile and said, "It's an old building. Weird things happen. Don't think too much about it." That was the last straw. I decided then and there that I wasn't sticking around to figure out what the key to nothing actually opened. I told Susan I was quitting at the end of the week, and she didn't seem surprised. I think she knew something was off about that place, but she wasn't about to say it out loud. On my last night, I decided to take one final look at the key. I told myself it was just curiosity, that I wanted closure, but deep down, I think I was hoping for something else. Something that would explain everything. When I reached the gallery, the room felt colder than usual. The glass case was still there, still locked, but the key looked different. It wasn't glowing anymore. It was dull, almost ordinary. I leaned in close, my breath fogging up the glass. For a moment, I thought I saw my reflection staring back at me, but it wasn't my reflection. The face in the glass was mine, but the eyes were wrong. They were too dark, too hollow, and they didn't blink when I did. I don't remember leaving the museum. I don't even remember driving home. All I know is that when I woke up the next morning, the job was over, and I never went back. I still think about the key sometimes. About the man, or whatever he was, standing in front of the case. About the way the mirrors in my apartment sometimes catch movement that shouldn't be there. And about the faint sound of footsteps I still hear at night, even when I know I'm alone. So I'll ask you, Have you ever encountered something you couldn't explain? Something that felt small at first, but left a mark on you that wouldn't fade? If you have, I'd love to hear your story. Maybe it'll make me feel less like the key to nothing is still waiting for me. Or maybe it'll just remind me that some doors are better left locked. The first thing I noticed about the suitcase was how clean it was. Not a single scratch, smudge, or scuff on the leather, even though it had been sitting in the alley behind my apartment building for who knows how long. Black, sleek, and perfectly square, with polished silver buckles that gleamed like they'd been shined that morning. I hadn't planned on noticing it at all. I was only out there to take the trash to the dumpster, a task I hated because the alley always smelled like sour milk and wet cardboard. But the suitcase was impossible to ignore. It was just there, resting upright in the middle of the pavement, like someone had placed it down and walked away with every intention of coming back. Except there was no one around. I paused, looking up and down the narrow alley. The morning sun cast harsh shadows between the buildings, but it didn't reveal anything unusual. No footsteps echoing, no doors slamming, no signs of movement at all. Just me, the dumpster, and the suitcase. For a moment, I thought about leaving it there. It wasn't my problem. People left weird stuff in alleys all the time. Old furniture, broken TVs, the occasional mattress, and I didn't want to get involved. But something about the suitcase felt different. It was too deliberate, too pristine, out of place in a way that made my skin prickle. Before I could talk myself out of it, I stepped closer. The handle was down, the latches shut tight. There was no brand logo, no identification tag, no way of knowing who it belonged to or why it had been left there. I crouched down, my breath misting faintly in the cool morning air, and hesitated. If I opened it, I'd be crossing some kind of line. Into what? I didn't know. But the longer I stared at it, the harder it became to ignore the tiny voice in the back of my mind that said, "Do it." I reached for the latches. The moment I flipped them open, a low hum filled the air. Not loud, but insistent, like the hum of an old refrigerator or the faint buzz of electricity in a quiet room. The hair on my arms stood on end. Inside the suitcase was a single object, a watch. It wasn't a modern watch, not digital or sleek. Nothing you'd find in a department store. It was old, with a round brass face and delicate hands that ticked steadily despite the absence of any visible gears or battery. The leather strap was cracked and worn, but the watch itself looked almost alive, like the light that hit it was being drawn into its surface, absorbed and reflected back in subtle, shifting patterns. I picked it up, the hum growing louder as I held it in my palm. The face wasn't like any clock I'd seen before. It didn't have numbers, just faint markings around the edge, like tiny constellations etched into the brass. And the hands weren't moving in a way that made sense. They didn't follow a regular pattern. They jumped and shifted, ticking forward and backward in strange, uneven bursts. I should have put it back, closed the suitcase, walked away. But before I could make up my mind, the watch started ticking faster, the hum deepening into a low vibration that I could feel in my chest. And then, without warning, the second hand stopped completely. The alley was gone. I was standing in the middle of a field, the grass tall and golden, rippling in a wind I couldn't feel. The sky above was vast and unnervingly close, the clouds moving faster than they should, like they were being sped up in a time lapse. There was no sound except for the faint ticking of the watch in my hand, which had started moving again, its hands spinning wildly. I turned in a slow circle, trying to make sense of where I was, but the field stretched out endlessly in every direction. No buildings, no trees, no people, just me and the watch. And then I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the horizon. So far away it was little more than a smudge of shadow against the golden grass. I don't know why, but I started walking toward it. The closer I got, the more details emerged. The figure wasn't standing. It was sitting on a wooden chair, perfectly upright, its hands folded neatly in its lap. It was dressed in black, a long coat that hung down to the ground, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over its face. When I was close enough to see the shine of its boots, it spoke. "You took the watch," it said, its voice calm and deliberate, like it was stating a fact. I stopped a few feet away, clutching the watch tightly in my hand. What is this place? The figure tilted its head slightly, the shadow of the hat shifting. This is where the seconds go. The seconds? I echoed, not understanding. The ones that slip through the cracks, it said. The seconds you lose when you glance at the clock and swear it skipped ahead. The moments you can't account for. They all come here. I looked down at the watch in my hand. Its hands were still spinning erratically, jumping forward and backward, the ticking growing louder. Why do I have this? I asked. The figure stood, its movements slow and deliberate. It was taller than I expected, and when it stepped closer, I instinctively stepped back. The watch chooses its keeper, it said, and the keeper carries the weight of the lost time. What does that mean? I asked, my voice rising with panic. I didn't ask for this. The figure stopped, tilting its head again. Few do. I wanted to throw the watch, to drop it and run, but my fingers wouldn't let go. The hum had returned, louder now, vibrating through my bones. The sky above was spinning faster, the clouds blending into streaks of gray and white, and the grass around us rippled like water. Let me go, I said, my voice cracking. The figure raised a hand, its long fingers pale and smooth, like porcelain. If you leave, the watch stays, and the seconds will be yours no longer. I don't want the seconds, I said, my breath coming in shallow bursts. The figure stepped back, lowering its hand, then returned to the alley. But know this, the seconds will find you again. They always do. Before I could ask what it meant, the hum surged, the field dissolving into a blur of gold and gray. And then I was back. The alley was exactly as I'd left it. The dumpster, the cracked pavement, the faint smell of sour milk in the air. The suitcase was still there, its latches open, its interior empty. The watch was gone. For a moment, I stood there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But the memory was already slipping, like water running through my fingers. I looked down at my hands, half expecting to see the watch reappear. But there was nothing. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. That night, I dreamed of ticking clocks and fields of gold, of seconds slipping through my hands like grains of sand. And in the morning, when I glanced at the clock on my kitchen wall, I could have sworn it skipped ahead by 3 seconds. There's a street in my neighborhood that doesn't exist. I don't mean that it's haunted or cursed or has some creepy urban legend attached to it. I mean it genuinely doesn't exist. Not on maps, not on GPS, not even in the memories of people who've lived here their whole lives. But every so often, when I walk home a certain way, there it is, narrow and unmarked, sandwiched between 2 familiar blocks like it's always been there. A street with no name. The first time I noticed it, I assumed I just never paid attention before. It was late, and the sodium yellow streetlights made everything look strange and unfamiliar. I saw the turn, lined with leaning lamp posts and uneven cobblestones, and thought, weird. I've lived here for years. How have I never walked this way? So I turned. The air felt cooler the moment I stepped onto the cobblestones, like the temperature had dropped a few degrees in the span of a single step. The buildings were old, older than anything else in the neighborhood, their facades worn smooth by time and weather. Most of them were 3 or 4 stories tall, with dark, shuttered windows and ivy creeping up their walls. A faint mist hung in the air, swirling softly around my ankles as I walked. It should have been eerie, but it wasn't. If anything, it felt calm, peaceful. There was no one else on the street, which struck me as odd. It wasn't that late, maybe 9 or 10, but I didn't see a single person. No cars parked by the curbs, no lights in the windows, no sound except for the faint click of my shoes against the cobblestones. I thought about turning back, but the further I went, the more curious I became. The street curved gently, just enough to keep me from seeing where it led, and I couldn't shake the feeling that if I walked just a little farther, I'd find something worth seeing. Halfway down the street, I noticed the shop. It was the only building with its windows lit, a soft amber glow spilling onto the stones outside. The sign above the door was small and unassuming, painted with a single word in a language I didn't recognize. The window display was cluttered but oddly beautiful. An antique clock with hands frozen at 12:07, a birdcage with no bird inside, a stack of leather-bound books so old their titles had worn away. There was something about it that made me pause, my hand resting on the door handle. It felt like stepping inside would be significant, though I couldn't have said why. The bell above the door jingled softly as I entered. The interior smelled of old paper and something floral, like dried lavender. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with objects that seemed to have no rhyme or reason. A glass jar full of marbles, a violin missing its strings, a box of seashells arranged by size. At the counter stood a woman, her gray hair pulled into a loose bun. She wore a dark apron over a simple blouse, and her glasses were perched low on her nose. She looked up when I came in, her expression neutral but not unkind. "Hello," she said. "Looking for something?" "I'm not sure," I admitted. "I didn't even know this street existed." She smiled faintly, like she'd heard that before. "Most people don't, but you're here, so maybe there's something you need." I glanced around the shop. "What kind of store is this?" "It's not really a store," she said, as if that explained anything. "But feel free to look around." I didn't know what else to do, so I started browsing. The shelves were packed with items that seemed random at first, but the longer I looked, the more I noticed patterns. There was a shelf filled entirely with keys, each one labeled with a small tag that didn't list a location or a lock, but an emotion. Regret, forgiveness, curiosity. Another held jars of dirt from places I couldn't pronounce, and next to them was a collection of broken watches, all labeled with names. Henry, Sophia, Amara. I didn't touch anything, but I felt like I could have stood there forever, trying to piece together the stories behind each object. Eventually, my eyes landed on a small wooden box sitting on a low shelf near the back of the shop. It was plain, with no markings or embellishments, and when I picked it up, it was lighter than I expected. I turned it over in my hands, but there was no latch, no hinge, no obvious way to open it. Still, it felt warm. Not physically warm, but like it had been sitting in sunlight just a moment ago, even though the shop didn't have any windows. I carried it to the counter. "What's this?" I asked, holding it out. The woman's expression changed slightly, though I couldn't tell if it was surprise, approval, or something else entirely. "That's yours," she said. "What do you mean, mine?" "You were meant to find it," she said simply. "Or it was meant to find you." I wanted to ask what that meant, but something stopped me. Instead, I asked, "How much?" She shook her head. "It's not for sale. It's already yours." I tried to press her further, but she wouldn't say anything else about it. So I left, the box tucked under my arm, and stepped back onto the cobblestones. The air felt heavier now, like the mist had thickened, and for the first time, I noticed how quiet the street was. Too quiet. I glanced back at the shop, but the lights were off now, the display window dark. The sign above the door had vanished. By the time I reached the end of the street, I was back in my neighborhood, standing under a familiar streetlight. When I turned to look behind me, the narrow street was gone. Just a solid row of buildings, the alley where it had been now a blank wall. That night, I sat in my apartment, staring at the box. No matter how long I held it, turned it over, or tapped its surface, it wouldn't open. I almost gave up, but just as I set it down, something shifted. A faint click, like a lock turning. Slowly, the lid creaked open, and inside was nothing. At least, nothing I could see. But as I sat there, staring into the empty box, I felt something change. It's hard to explain what it was. It wasn't like a memory or a feeling. It was more like a weight I didn't know I'd been carrying suddenly lifted. I felt lighter, clearer, like a thread that had been tangled in my chest for years had finally been pulled free. I didn't know what it meant or why it mattered, but it felt good, important. I still think about that street sometimes. I've tried to find it again, but it's never there. I've even asked people in the neighborhood about it, but no one seems to know what I'm talking about. The box sits on my shelf now, closed and quiet. I've thought about getting rid of it, but I can't bring myself to. It feels like it's still holding something, even if I can't see it. Something I'm not ready to let go of just yet. So, what about you? If you found a street that wasn't supposed to exist, would you keep walking? And if you found something waiting for you there, would you take it home or leave it behind? I met Seoul on the hottest day of the year, when the city felt like it was being slow-cooked in its own humidity. I was at the park, lying flat on my back in the shade of a lopsided oak tree, regretting every decision that had led me to leave my air-conditioned apartment. The cicadas were screaming, my water bottle was empty, and I had convinced myself that even breathing too hard would make me sweat more. That's when I heard someone mutter, "This is gonna be spectacularly stupid," followed by a very loud splash. I sat up just in time to see someone, Seoul, emerging from the park's decorative fountain, soaking wet and grinning like they'd just invented a new sport. The fountain wasn't even the kind you're supposed to wade in. It was one of those shallow, picturesque ones meant to look nice in Instagram photos, with a bronze statue of a cherub at the center and water that probably hadn't been cleaned since the city budget cuts 3 summers ago. Seoul had climbed out by the time I got a good look at them. Short hair dripping, sunglasses perched precariously on their nose, wearing a t-shirt with the words "Ask Me About My Invention" scrawled across it in marker. They grabbed a pair of beat-up sneakers from the grass and started whistling a tune I didn't recognize, as though they hadn't just gone for a casual swim in birdbath-grade water. "You're not supposed to do that," I said, before I could stop myself. They turned, grinning. "Says who?" "Says everyone? It's a fountain, not a pool." They shrugged and sat down on the edge of the fountain, pulling on their soaked sneakers. Desperate times, desperate measures. If the city doesn't want people swimming in fountains, they should stop building them during heat waves. I didn't have a response to that. Seoul pointed at me with one dripping sneaker. "You look like you're dying. You should try it." "Absolutely not." "Why not?" "Because I don't want to get arrested, for starters." They snorted. "What cop is gonna bother arresting someone for a fountain swim when it's 90 degrees? You think they want to get out of their cars in this heat?" They had a point, but I wasn't about to admit it. "It's gross," I said instead. "Gross is subjective," they replied, slipping on their sunglasses like that settled the matter. "What's your name?" "Maddie," I said, mostly because I didn't know what else to say. "Well, Maddie," they said, standing and wringing out the bottom of their shirt. "It's been a pleasure, but I've got a meeting with Destiny." "A meeting with what now?" "Destiny," they repeated, picking up a backpack that had been lying nearby. "And by Destiny, I mean I've got to fix a busted robot arm in my workshop before my landlord finds out I've been soldering in the living room again." I blinked. "A robot arm?" "Yep." "For what?" "Why not?" And just like that, they walked away, dripping water onto the sidewalk and leaving me with more questions than answers. I didn't expect to see Seoul again, but 2 weeks later, I was at the hardware store trying to replace the broken handle on my kitchen faucet when I spotted them in the next aisle over. They were holding a pair of pliers in one hand and what looked like a broken toaster in the other, squinting at a shelf full of screws. "You again," I said, because apparently I decided we were familiar enough for that. They looked up, grinned, and said, "Ah, Maddie of the Anti-Fountain Agenda. Long time no see. What are you doing with a toaster?" "Reinventing it," they replied, as if that were an entirely reasonable answer. "Into what?" They hesitated, then gestured vaguely. "A better toaster? Why don't you just buy one that works?" "Where's the fun in that?" Before I could argue, they tilted their head and studied me like I was a particularly interesting puzzle. "What are you doing here?" "Faucet handle," I said, holding up the sad, broken piece of plastic I'd brought as a reference. "Boring," they said with a grin. "Come on, let's fix your faucet and my toaster." Against my better judgment, I ended up following them to their so-called workshop, which turned out to be a tiny, overstuffed studio apartment crammed with half-finished projects. There was a bike frame suspended from the ceiling, a homemade 3D printer humming in the corner, and what looked like a makeshift catapult made out of PVC pipes and duct tape leaning against the wall. "Welcome to my lab," they said, dumping the toaster onto a cluttered workbench. "Your lab is an OSHA violation," I muttered, stepping over a pile of tangled wires. "Details, details," they said, waving me off. "Sit down. I'll find some glue for your faucet." I watched as they rifled through a drawer filled with tools, spare parts, and, bizarrely, 2 rubber ducks. "Do you actually know how to fix a faucet?" I asked. "Probably," they said with absolute confidence. And the toaster? Oh, definitely not, they admitted, pulling out a tube of epoxy. But it's worth a shot. We ended up spending the entire afternoon tinkering with things neither of us really knew how to fix. Sol was relentless, determined to make the toaster toast smarter, not harder, even though it sparked ominously every time they plugged it in. When it finally produced a slightly burnt slice of bread, they held it up triumphantly like it was the Holy Grail. "See," they said, grinning. "Perfect. It's burnt. It's artisanal." By the time I left, my faucet handle was still broken, but I was laughing harder than I had in weeks. Sol had that effect on people, I realized. They turned every problem into a challenge, every mishap into a story worth telling. Over the next few months, we fell into an odd sort of friendship. Sol would show up unannounced, dragging me into their latest experiment, testing a solar-powered blender in the park, building a miniature trebuchet to launch marshmallows, or designing a pair of self-cooling shoes using gel packs and Velcro. Half the time, their ideas didn't work, but that never seemed to bother them. "You've got to embrace the chaos," they told me once, as we tried to unstick a drone that had gotten tangled in a tree. "Otherwise, what's the point?" It was hard to argue with that, especially when their chaos was so much fun. One evening, as we sat on the roof of their apartment building watching the city lights flicker to life, I asked them why they spent so much time on things that seemed pointless. They thought about it for a moment, their sunglasses reflecting the orange glow of the sunset. "Because it's not about the thing," they said finally. "It's about what happens while you're doing it. You meet people, you make memories, you learn stuff, even if it's just how not to build a toaster that catches fire." I smiled, because of course that was their answer. Sol wasn't the kind of person who fit neatly into anyone's life. They were messy and unpredictable and occasionally infuriating, but they made everything feel more alive. They made me feel more alive. So when they turned to me and said, "Next weekend, I'm building a soapbox car. You in?" I didn't even hesitate. Absolutely. The postcard came in the mail on a Tuesday, even though no one sends postcards anymore. It was old-fashioned, the edges frayed and yellowed, the image on the front slightly faded. A black and white photograph of a lighthouse, standing tall against a restless sea. No name, no caption. Just a lighthouse, its beam cutting through clouds that looked heavy with storms. I flipped it over. The handwriting was thin and spidery, the kind you'd expect from someone who'd been using the same pen for decades. "Come back. It's waiting for you." That was it. No signature, no return address, no explanation. Just those 5 words, written with a kind of quiet certainty that made my stomach knot. I stared at it for longer than I care to admit, turning it over in my hands like the answers might be hiding in the paper itself. It didn't make sense. I didn't know anyone who lived near a lighthouse, or near the ocean at all, for that matter. And come back? I hadn't been anywhere to come back to. Still, it nagged at me. The postcard shouldn't have mattered. It was probably just a mistake, a weird piece of junk mail meant for someone else. But the words wouldn't leave me alone. I kept it on my desk, tucked under a stack of bills, and tried to ignore it. But over the next few days, the feeling that I was missing something started to grow. I'd catch myself staring at it, trying to make sense of the way the handwriting seemed to lean forward, like it was nudging me somewhere. By Friday, I gave in. The lighthouse in the photo wasn't familiar, but it had a look about it, something that felt like the East Coast. So, I spent an embarrassing amount of time on the internet, scrolling through images of lighthouses in Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island. I don't know what I was expecting to find. Closure, maybe. A reason to laugh at myself for getting worked up over nothing. And then I found it. There, buried in the search results, was the same lighthouse. The same craggy cliffs, the same jagged rocks below. Only this time, it was in color. The ocean was slate gray, the lighthouse a bright, defiant white. It was in a town I'd never heard of, a speck on the map in the northernmost corner of Maine. A town so small it didn't even show up on GPS unless you zoomed in all the way. I stared at the screen for a long time before finally saying it out loud, like I needed to hear how the name sounded in the air. Wicklow Point. The name tugged at something in the back of my mind. Not a memory, exactly, but the ghost of one. A faint, blurry shape I couldn't quite bring into focus. By Sunday, I was in the car. The drive took longer than I expected. Highways gave way to winding roads, which gave way to narrow dirt paths that seemed to disappear into endless trees. By the time I saw the first sign for Wicklow Point, the sun was already sinking into the horizon, painting the world in shades of orange and gray. The town itself was smaller than I imagined. A handful of weathered houses clustered around a main street that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1950s. A diner with a flickering neon sign. A general store with shelves stocked more out of habit than demand. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and everyone knew when a stranger rolled into town. I parked near the diner and got out, the cool, salty air hitting me like a wall. The sound of the ocean was faint but constant, a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to come from somewhere beneath my feet. Looking for something? The voice startled me. I turned to see an older woman standing on the diner's porch, her hands tucked into the pockets of a thick cardigan. She was watching me with the kind of casual curiosity that comes from boredom, her head tilted slightly to one side. "Yeah," I said, suddenly unsure of myself. "The lighthouse. Is it nearby?" Her expression shifted, just a flicker, but it was enough to make me uneasy. "Why were you looking for it?" I hesitated. "I got this," I said, pulling the postcard from my jacket pocket and holding it up. She squinted at it, her lips pressing into a thin line. For a moment, I thought she wasn't going to say anything, but then she nodded toward the end of the street. "Follow the road down to the cliffs. You'll see it." "Thanks," I said, but she didn't respond. She was already walking back into the diner, the screen door creaking shut behind her. The road was empty, the houses thinning out as I walked. The sound of the ocean grew louder, sharper, until I could feel it in my chest. And then, just as the last rays of sunlight disappeared, I saw it. The lighthouse stood at the edge of the cliffs, its white tower stark against the deep blue of the sky. The beams swept across the water, steady and rhythmic, casting long shadows over the rocks below. I don't know what I expected to feel, relief, maybe, or recognition, but all I felt was that same nagging pull, the sense that I was still missing something. The path leading up to the lighthouse was overgrown, the grass wet with dew. As I got closer, I noticed the door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. "Hello?" I called out, but there was no response. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The air smelled faintly of salt and mildew, and the only sound was the faint hum of the machinery somewhere above me. There was nothing inside. No furniture, no equipment, just an empty space that felt like it had been abandoned for years. And then I saw it. On the far wall, scratched into the peeling paint, were 3 words. "You found it." My chest tightened. The handwriting was the same as on the postcard, thin and spidery, leaning slightly forward. Before I could think, the door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing through the tower. I spun around, my heart hammering, but there was no one there. The light above me flickered, casting strange, jagged shadows across the walls. And then, slowly, I began to hear it. A voice. It wasn't loud, but it filled the space, wrapping around me like a tide pulling me under. It spoke in whispers, fragments, pieces of sentences I couldn't string together. "Come back. Always waiting. Don't leave again." The air grew heavier, pressing against me, and I stumbled backward, my hand brushing against the wall. The words seemed to twist and shift, their meaning slipping through my fingers like water. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The light steadied, the air cleared, and the door creaked open, letting in a sharp gust of wind. I didn't wait. I ran, my feet slipping on the wet grass as I made my way back to the car. I don't know what I found in that lighthouse, or what it wanted from me. I don't know who sent the postcard, or why they thought I needed to come back. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those words scratched into the wall. "You found it." And I wonder if it found me, too. There is a shop in my neighborhood that's always open but never busy. You wouldn't notice it unless you were looking for it, and even then, you might walk right past. The storefront is narrow, squeezed between a pawn shop and a dry cleaner, with a small wooden sign above the door that reads simply, oddments. There's no display in the window, just a curtain of faded velvet that hides the interior from view. No advertisements, no neon, open, sign buzzing faintly in the night. And yet, whenever you walk by, the door is unlocked. Always. The first time I went in, I didn't mean to. It was raining. One of those cold, relentless drizzles that soaks through your clothes no matter how fast you run. My umbrella had broken 2 blocks back, flipping inside out with a dramatic snap that startled a nearby dog, and I ducked into the nearest doorway for shelter. I didn't even realize it was a shop until I felt the warmth of the air inside, the soft scent of sandalwood and something faintly metallic wrapping around me. The door closed behind me with a quiet click, and I turned, wiping rain from my face. The shop was smaller than I expected, much smaller, and packed from floor to ceiling with shelves that groaned under the weight of objects I couldn't immediately identify. The light was dim, coming from mismatched lamps scattered around the room, their shades casting strange, uneven shadows across the walls. It felt like stepping into someone's attic, the kind of place where everything has a story but none of it is labeled. "Help you with something?" The voice came from behind the counter, where a man was leaning with his elbows propped up on the glass. He had the kind of face you forget the moment you stop looking at it. Not unpleasant, just indistinct. Brown eyes, brown hair, no distinguishing features. He wore a dark vest over a white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and his hands were ink-stained, as though he'd been writing something just before I arrived. I hesitated, glancing around, getting out of the rain. He smiled, faint but genuine. "Happens all the time. Feel free to look around." I didn't plan to stay, but something about the shop drew me in. The shelves were cluttered with objects that defied categorization. A compass with no needle, a jar filled with black sand, a small porcelain bird missing one wing. There were stacks of books whose titles were written in languages I didn't recognize, and jars filled with liquids that shimmered faintly under the lamplight. On one shelf, a row of glass bottles contained what looked like clouds, swirling lazily against the glass. "What is all this?" I asked, running my fingers over the edge of a wooden box carved with intricate patterns. "Oddments," the man replied, as though that explained everything. I picked up the box and turned it over in my hands. It was heavier than I expected, its surface cool and smooth. There was no latch or hinge, just a seam running along the middle where it looked like it should open. "What's in this?" "Depends," he said, his tone casual. "What are you looking for?" I raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to elaborate, but he didn't. He just watched me with an expression that was equal parts curious and amused. I set the box down and moved to the next shelf, where a small brass telescope caught my eye. When I lifted it, the air around me seemed to hum faintly, as though the telescope itself was vibrating. I peered through the lens and was startled to see not the shop, but a vast, star-filled expanse, as though I were looking directly into space. The stars moved slowly, swirling in patterns that felt deliberate, almost alive. I pulled the telescope away, blinking, and the shop reappeared, quiet and still. "Interesting, isn't it?" the man said. I turned to him, holding up the telescope. "How does this work?" He shrugged. "Depends on what you're hoping to see." I opened my mouth to press him further, but something in his expression stopped me. He wasn't being evasive. He was genuinely answering my questions in the same strange, roundabout way that seemed to define the shop itself. I set the telescope back on the shelf, my fingers brushing against a small pocket watch sitting beside it. The watch was tarnished, its glass face cracked, but when I picked it up, the hands began to move. Slowly at first, then faster, spinning wildly as though racing against some unseen clock. "Careful with that one," the man said. "It doesn't keep time. It takes it." "What does that mean?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped out from behind the counter and walked toward me, his hands in his pockets. Up close, he seemed older than I'd first thought, though it was hard to tell exactly why. His face hadn't changed, but there was something in the way he carried himself, something in the way his eyes seemed to hold more weight than they should. He took the watch from my hands and set it back on the shelf with a careful, deliberate motion. "This isn't the kind of place where you take things lightly," he said. "Everything here comes with a cost. What kind of cost? Depends on what you're willing to lose. The way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. I glanced around the shop again, suddenly aware of how quiet it was. The faint hum I'd noticed earlier seemed louder now, vibrating in my chest, and the objects on the shelves seemed to shimmer faintly, as though the light itself was bending around them. I should probably go, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He nodded, stepping back toward the counter. Most people do. I hesitated, my eyes lingering on the wooden box I'd picked up earlier. Something about it still pulled at me, a quiet, persistent curiosity that I couldn't shake. What happens if I take something? His smile was faint, almost sad. You won't know until you do. I left without taking anything, stepping back into the rain-soaked street with the scent of sandalwood still clinging to my clothes. But the shop stayed with me. I couldn't stop thinking about it, about the strange objects on the shelves and the way the man had spoken, as though everything in the shop was alive in its own way. 2 weeks later, I went back. The door was still unlocked, the air inside still warm and faintly metallic. The man greeted me with the same quiet smile, as though he'd been expecting me. I walked straight to the wooden box, lifting it from the shelf without hesitation. It felt heavier this time, its surface warmer against my skin. I turned to him, my heart pounding. What's inside? His answer was the same as before. Depends on what you're looking for. I left the shop with the box that day, the door clicking shut softly behind me. I haven't opened it yet. It sits on my desk, heavy and silent, its carvings catching the light in strange, shifting patterns. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear it hum, a faint vibration that feels like a question waiting to be answered. I don't know what I'm looking for, but I think the box does. There's an abandoned radio station on the outskirts of town. No one knows exactly when it shut down, but it's been there for as long as I can remember. A squat, crumbling building surrounded by cracked asphalt and overgrown weeds. It's the kind of place teenagers dare each other to break into, though most chicken out before they even make it past the rusted chain-link fence. The call letters, WQRF, are still painted and peeling white above the front doors, but the windows are boarded up, and the tall broadcast antenna leans at a precarious angle, its once bright red paint faded to a sickly orange. I wasn't supposed to be there. I'd never been the kind of person who sought out strange places, or who poked at things better left alone. But that night, I couldn't sleep. It wasn't just insomnia. It was something worse, a tight, pressing unease that made my apartment feel claustrophobic. I'd paced the length of my tiny living room a dozen times before finally grabbing my keys and heading out. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay where I was. The radio station was lit up when I got there. Not completely. The windows were still dark, and the building itself looked just as dead as it always had. But the tower was glowing faintly, a soft green light pulsing along its length like the heartbeat of something enormous and alive. It was the kind of light you might mistake for a trick of the moon, or maybe some forgotten hazard beacon flickering back to life, but it wasn't either of those. It was too steady, too deliberate, and it made my stomach churn in a way I couldn't explain. I should have left. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to drive back home and crawl under the covers and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But something about the light pulled at me, the same way you can't help but peek behind the curtain of a stage even when you know you're not supposed to. The chain-link fence was still there, but the gate hung open, the padlock broken and rusted to the ground. I stepped through cautiously, my sneakers crunching against gravel, and the sound seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. The closer I got to the building, the more the air seemed to thrum, faint and low, like the bass of a song just out of earshot. The front doors were unlocked. I pushed one open with my shoulder, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The interior was worse than I'd imagined. The walls were streaked with graffiti, and the floor was littered with broken furniture, beer bottles, and the unmistakable smell of mildew. A long desk with a shattered glass partition stretched across the lobby, and behind it, a tattered poster hung crookedly on the wall. It showed a grinning DJ holding a vinyl record, his cartoonish face frozen in a smile that felt more mocking than inviting. But the hum was stronger here, vibrating faintly in my bones. It was coming from deeper inside the building, pulling me toward a door marked Studio A. The sign was smeared with something dark. Maybe grease, maybe something worse, but I pushed the door open anyway, my breath catching in my throat as I stepped through. The studio was pristine. It made no sense. The rest of the building was falling apart, but this room looked untouched, like it had been frozen in time. A large mixing console dominated the center, its rows of knobs and sliders gleaming faintly under the soft green glow spilling in from the tower outside. A microphone hung from a scissor arm stand, perfectly positioned in front of a chair that didn't have a speck of dust on it. And on the far wall, taking up almost the entire surface, was a window that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't a window in the normal sense. It didn't look outside. It looked into something else. I walked toward it slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. The glass, or whatever it was smooth and black, swirling faintly like smoke trapped behind a pane. And as I got closer, I realized there was something moving inside it. Shapes. At first, I couldn't make them out, but the longer I stared, the clearer they became. Shadows shifting and stretching, forming silhouettes that didn't make sense. Too many limbs, too many angles, like they'd been stitched together from pieces that didn't belong. They weren't random, though. They moved with purpose, gliding across the dark surface of the window in patterns that felt deliberate, like they were waiting for something. And then they stopped. All at once, the shapes froze, and I felt the air in the room grow heavier, pressing down on my chest like I was suddenly miles underwater. One of the shapes moved again, slowly, deliberately, until it was directly in front of me. It leaned closer, its edges rippling like heat waves, and though it didn't have eyes, I knew it was looking at me. The microphone clicked. The sound startled me so badly I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the chair behind me. The hum in the air grew louder, almost unbearable, as the shapes in the window began to shift again, faster now, more chaotic. And then a voice crackled to life over the speakers. "Welcome back." It wasn't a voice I recognized. It wasn't even a voice I could describe. It was deep and layered, like a chorus of people all speaking at once, their tones weaving in and out of each other. The words felt more like vibrations than sounds, thrumming in my chest in time with the pulsing light outside. I couldn't move. The voice spoke again, slower this time, as though savoring each word. "You shouldn't have left us waiting." The shadows in the window shifted violently, their forms twisting and colliding as the room seemed to darken around me. The glow from the tower outside flared brighter, flooding the studio with green light, and the shapes began to push against the glass, their edges warping as though the window couldn't contain them anymore. I turned and ran. The hallway was longer than I remembered, stretching endlessly in front of me as the air grew colder, the hum behind me turning into a roar. The graffiti on the walls seemed to writhe, the colors bleeding together, and the grinning DJ from the poster seemed to follow me with his eyes, his painted smile widening unnaturally. When I finally burst through the front doors, the air outside was so sharp and cold it burned my lungs. The tower's light had faded, leaving the parking lot in eerie darkness, and the building behind me was silent, as if nothing had happened. But I could still feel it. Something had shifted, something subtle but unshakable, like the world wasn't quite aligned anymore. And in the back of my mind, I could still hear the voice, its words echoing faintly, impossibly clear. "Welcome back. I don't go near the radio station anymore. I don't even drive past it. But some nights, when I can't sleep, I hear the faint hum of static, and I know the tower is still waiting." It wasn't every day that my mailbox decided to talk to me. In fact, I'm fairly certain it wasn't supposed to do that at all. But there it was, our rusty, dented apartment complex mailbox, whispering my name as I reached for the stack of bills and pizza coupons crammed into my slot. "Eli," it said, its voice soft and gravelly, like an old record player that hadn't been cleaned in decades. I froze, hand halfway to the mail. "What?" The mailbox rattled slightly, as if clearing its throat. "Eli," it said again, "you're late." "Late for what?" I whispered, glancing over my shoulder to see if anyone else was witnessing this madness. The hallway was empty except for the flickering fluorescent light above me, buzzing faintly in the stale air. "For your letter," the mailbox replied, as if that explained everything. "What letter?" It didn't answer. Instead, the slot directly above mine, a box that hadn't been used in years, creaked open and spat out an envelope. The envelope fluttered to the ground like a wounded bird, landing at my feet with a soft plop. I stared at it for a moment, half expecting it to grow legs and run away. It didn't. The envelope was plain and unassuming, sealed with a blob of crimson wax stamped with a symbol I didn't recognize. A circle with 3 intersecting lines, like a compass gone haywire. My name, just my first name, Eli, was written on the front in elegant, looping handwriting. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. The paper was thick and slightly rough, like something out of an antique shop. Before I could stop myself, I broke the seal and pulled out the folded letter inside. The handwriting was the same, flowing and precise, but what it said made my stomach twist. "Eli, do not go home tonight. They'll be waiting for you. Take the bus to Elmwood. Sit in the 3rd seat from the back. Do not look out the windows." That was it. No signature, no explanation. Just that. I stuffed the letter back into the envelope, my heart pounding. Someone was messing with me. This had to be a prank. Maybe one of my neighbors had too much time on their hands and decided to liven up a boring Tuesday with some cryptic nonsense. But as I stood there, clutching the envelope, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The hallway stretched ahead, silent and empty, but the fluorescent light flickered again, casting shifting shadows on the peeling wallpaper. I stuffed the letter into my jacket pocket and hurried back outside, my mind racing. My apartment was only a 10-minute walk away, and yet the words of the letter echoed in my head. "Do not go home tonight. They'll be waiting for you." It was ridiculous, wasn't it? Some random letter from a talking mailbox couldn't possibly. A loud crack snapped me out of my thoughts. I stopped, turning toward the sound. The street was empty, but the streetlight nearest me had gone out, leaving a dark stretch of sidewalk ahead. I glanced behind me. Another streetlight flickered once, then twice, and then died with a faint pop. The unease in my chest deepened. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was instinct, or maybe some part of me just wanted to believe the impossible. But instead of walking toward my building, I turned left and headed for the nearest bus stop. The bench was empty when I got there, its paint peeling under the weak glow of the overhead light. The schedule taped to the pole said the next bus was due in 3 minutes. I stood there, hands stuffed in my jacket pockets, trying to convince myself I wasn't completely insane. The bus arrived exactly 3 minutes later, its brakes hissing as it pulled up in front of me. The doors wheezed open, and I hesitated for just a second before climbing on. The driver, a grizzled man with a face like crumpled paper, gave me a cursory glance before nodding toward the rows of empty seats. "Elmwood?" I asked, my voice sounding small. He nodded once, tapping the meter with a bony finger. I swiped my card, the machine beeping in approval, and made my way down the aisle. The bus was almost completely empty, save for a woman in the front row, staring blankly out the windshield, and a kid in a hoodie slumped in one of the middle seats. I slid into the 3rd seat from the back, just like the letter had said, and sat stiffly, clutching the edge of my jacket. The bus rumbled to life, its engine growling as it pulled away from the curb. For the first few minutes, everything was normal. The hum of the engine, the faint squeak of the suspension, the rhythmic thump of the wheels over uneven pavement. But then I remembered the last line of the letter. "Do not look out the windows." That was easier said than done. The city blurred past outside, neon signs and street lamps casting fractured colors against the glass. I told myself it was fine, that the letter was just a stupid joke, and that there was no harm in glancing outside. So I did, and I immediately regretted it. The city wasn't there anymore. Where there should have been buildings and sidewalks and parked cars, there was nothing. Not darkness, not a void, but a shimmering expanse of pale gray, like the surface of a mirror fogged with breath. Shapes flickered in and out of the mist, tall and angular, moving with a jerky, stilted grace. I tore my eyes away, heart hammering. "What are you doing?" The voice made me jump. I looked up to see the kid in the hoodie standing in the aisle, staring at me with wide, bloodshot eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. I was just... You looked, he said, his voice a harsh whisper. You weren't supposed to look. I didn't. Do you know what happens when you look? He interrupted, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush. They see you. Now they know where you are. I stared at him, my throat dry. What are you talking about? His gaze flicked to the windows, and he flinched, taking a step back. They're coming. Who's coming? Before he could answer, the bus screeched to a stop. The lights inside flickered, and the driver's voice crackled over the intercom. End of the line, he said, his tone devoid of any emotion. The doors wheezed open, and the kid grabbed my arm, his grip like iron. Don't get off, he said urgently. Whatever you do, don't. And then he was gone. One moment he was there, and the next, he was gone, like a glitch in a video game. I bolted upright, my eyes darting around the bus. The woman in the front row was gone too, and the driver was staring straight ahead, unmoving. Outside, the mist swirled closer, pressing against the windows like it was alive. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. Clutching the letter in my pocket, I ran for the doors and jumped into the mist. When I was 16, I found a notebook in the gutter on my way home from school. It was raining that day, the kind of rain that made everything look darker and shinier, like the world was coated in wet ink. I almost didn't notice it, lying there half submerged in a puddle, its cover warped and peeling. But something about it caught my eye, the faint gold lettering stamped across the front. It said, Mistakes, Volume 2. I picked it up without thinking, shaking the water off as best I could. The pages were soaked and curling at the edges, the words inside smudged and blurry. I could only make out fragments here and there. Should have called her back. Too late to fix it now. Should have kept my mouth shut. I carried it home and left it on the radiator to dry, not really sure why I was bothering. It didn't belong to anyone I knew, and there was no name or address inside. Just pages and pages of handwritten regrets, all jumbled together like a messy confession. The next morning, when the notebook had dried out, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The last page was blank except for a single line written in tiny, cramped letters. Write your mistake, and it'll fix itself. I laughed when I saw it, thinking it was someone's idea of a joke. But as I read through the notebook again, something about the words started to stick with me. They weren't just generic regrets. They were weirdly specific. There was one about forgetting to bring an umbrella and getting sick, another about dropping a plate at a fancy dinner party. Little things, sure, but they were written with such raw emotion it felt like whoever had written them was trying to undo something. I didn't think much of it until later that afternoon, when I spilled soda all over my math homework. It wasn't a huge deal, just an inconvenience, but I was annoyed with myself for being clumsy. Then I remembered the notebook. I grabbed it from the radiator and flipped to the last page, my hands shaking a little. It felt stupid, like believing in a magic trick even though you know it's fake. Still, I found myself writing, spilled soda on my math homework. The ink bled slightly on the warped paper, but the moment I finished the sentence, I felt a weird, static-like sensation in my fingers, like they'd brushed against a TV screen. I shook my hand out and set the notebook down, trying to ignore the faint hum in the back of my head that said something was about to happen. When I looked back at my desk, the homework was dry. Completely dry. The soda stain was gone. The paper smooth and unwrinkled, as if it had never happened. I didn't know what to think. Part of me was thrilled, part of me terrified. I wanted to test it again, but I couldn't think of another mistake worth fixing. So I shoved the notebook under my bed and tried to forget about it. Of course, I didn't forget. The next time I used it was a week later, after I bombed a chemistry quiz. I'd studied, but I froze up the moment the paper hit my desk, my brain refusing to cooperate. When I got my grade back, I felt that familiar surge of self-loathing. The one that said, you're never going to be good enough, so why bother trying? That night, I pulled out the notebook and wrote, failed my chemistry quiz. The next morning, when I walked into class, my teacher handed me a different quiz, the same questions, but rewritten in a way that made sense to me. There was an issue with the original, she said. Everyone's getting a redo. It worked. Again. I started using the notebook more often after that. Little things at first. Forgetting my lunch, losing my keys, tripping on the stairs. Every time I wrote a mistake down, it would disappear, undone like it had never happened. It felt like magic, like I'd been given a cheat code for life. But then I got greedy. There was a girl in my class, Becca, who I'd had a crush on since forever. She was the kind of person who made everything look effortless. Perfect grades, perfect hair, perfect smile. She didn't know I existed, and I hated myself for not having the courage to talk to her. One night, I opened the notebook and wrote, "Didn't tell Becca how I feel." The next day, she sat down next to me at lunch. "Hey," she said, smiling in a way that made my stomach flip. "You're Evan, right?" I nodded, too stunned to speak. We talked for hours that day, and by the end of the week, we were inseparable. It was everything I'd ever wanted, and for a while, I convinced myself it was real. But then I started noticing little things, strange gaps in her memory, moments where she seemed to lose track of what she was saying. Once, I mentioned a joke she'd made the day before, and she looked at me like I was speaking a different language. "I don't remember that," she said, her voice flat and distant. It got worse. One day, I found her sitting alone in the cafeteria, staring at the wall like she didn't recognize where she was. When I asked her what was wrong, she said, "I don't know. I just feel off, like I'm not supposed to be here." That night, I stared at the notebook for hours, trying to decide what to do. I knew, deep down, that I'd crossed a line. The notebook wasn't meant to be used like this. Fixing spilled soda and bad grades was one thing, but forcing someone to like me? That wasn't fixing a mistake. It was making one. With shaking hands, I wrote, "Told Becca how I feel." The next day, she didn't sit with me at lunch. She didn't even look at me. It was like none of it had ever happened, and in a way, I guess it hadn't. I stopped using the notebook after that. At least, I tried to. But it's hard to ignore something like that once you've seen what it can do. Every time I made a mistake, forgot to study, said the wrong thing, let someone down, I felt its weight, the temptation to pull out the notebook and make it all go away. Sometimes I gave in. Most of the time, I didn't. The last time I used it was 2 years later, after a fight with my dad. It was bad, the kind of fight where you say things you don't mean just to hurt the other person. I stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind me, and spent the rest of the night driving aimlessly around town. When I got home, he was gone. Heart attack, they said. Sudden, unexpected, nothing anyone could have done. I sat on the floor of my room for hours, clutching the notebook. I wanted to write it down, to undo the fight, to bring him back. I wanted to fix everything, but I didn't. I tore the notebook into pieces and burned it in the fireplace. The flames turned the pages to ash, the words disappearing into smoke. Some mistakes, I realized, aren't meant to be fixed. Here's my question. If you had the power to undo your mistakes, would you use it? Would you make your life perfect? Or would you let it stay messy, flawed, and real? And if you did use it, how far would you go before you couldn't stop? Amira noticed the oddity first in the reflection of her morning coffee. The surface was smooth, undisturbed, save for the subtle swirl of cream she'd added moments earlier. But when she leaned closer, something shifted. Her reflection was wrong. Not grotesquely or obviously so, but in the way a memory feels off, like a detail misplaced. She tilted her head, and the figure in the coffee hesitated before following. Her breath caught, and she set the mug down, her heart beating faster than it should for something so small. She told herself it was nothing, a trick of light or exhaustion. The week had been long, longer than most, and her body bore the signs of it. The dark smudges under her eyes, the tension coiled between her shoulders. The city had felt strange lately, too, its hum quieter, its rhythm uneven. Trains ran late without explanation. Streetlights flickered even in the absence of storms. Once, she turned the corner on her way home and found an entire block missing, replaced by a hollow expanse of fenced dirt and machinery she swore hadn't been there the day before. No one else seemed to notice. She was brushing her teeth that evening when it happened again. The mirror over her sink reflected her face as expected, pale and drawn, her hair in its usual chaos. But the motion lagged, just by a fraction of a second, a hesitation barely perceptible. She froze, her toothbrush clattering into the sink, her gaze locked with the reflections. It held her stare, then smiled. Amira hadn't smiled. The room seemed colder as she backed away, leaving the toothbrush abandoned. The reflection's smile lingered, even as she fled the bathroom. She turned off the light and slammed the door shut, her pulse a drumbeat in her ears. She didn't return until morning, and when she did, the mirror looked normal. She avoided her own eyes anyway. Over the next few days, it became harder to ignore. Glass panes caught her moving in ways she hadn't, reflections tilting their heads at wrong angles, gestures lagging as though trapped underwater. It wasn't always the same, and it didn't happen everywhere. Some mirrors reflected her perfectly, a crisp and obedient twin. Others didn't. By the end of the week, she couldn't trust her windows, the polished elevator doors at work, or even the puddles pooling on the sidewalk after a brief rainstorm. Reflections bent subtly, as if studying her, watching her reactions, waiting for something. Her co-workers noticed her distraction, her jumpiness, but she waved it off, muttering excuses about poor sleep and caffeine crashes. The breaking point came late Friday night. She was walking home, the streets nearly empty, the air heavy with the smell of wet asphalt. She passed a store window, a simple boutique with neatly arranged displays of dresses and shoes. Amira glanced at the glass as she walked by and saw her reflection staring back, not following her movement but standing still, eyes fixed on her. She froze, her breath hitching. The reflection raised a hand, palm pressed to the inside of the glass. Then it stepped forward. The moment stretched endlessly as the reflection crossed the threshold of the glass. It moved with a fluidity Amira didn't recognize in herself, its features sharper, its smile uncomfortably wide. It stopped just outside the window, standing in the same space she occupied. But it wasn't her. Not exactly. The clothing was wrong, a dress she hadn't owned in years. The shoes, too, were familiar but misplaced, discarded long ago. The reflection looked at her with something between curiosity and malice. Amira stumbled backward, her voice caught in her throat. "Who are you?" she managed, the words shaky. The reflection didn't answer. Instead, it tilted its head, studying her like a puzzle. Then, without warning, it turned and walked away, its footsteps silent. Amira watched as it disappeared down the street, the night swallowing it whole. She stood there for what felt like hours, her breath fogging the cold glass of the boutique window. She didn't sleep that night. The apartment felt too quiet, every creak of the floorboards amplified in her ears. She checked the mirrors compulsively, half expecting the reflection to step out again, to confront her with its strange, too perfect mimicry. But the glass remained empty save for her own haunted face. When morning came, she made a decision. She left her apartment with no destination, her feet carrying her aimlessly through the city. The streets felt too bright, too sharp, as though everything had been turned up a notch beyond natural. She avoided looking at her reflection in passing windows and cars, but the urge gnawed at her. By the time she reached the edge of the park, her curiosity won out. The lake in the park was a flat sheet of silver, undisturbed by ducks or wind. Amira knelt at its edge, her breath forming faint clouds in the cool air. Slowly, she leaned forward, her reflection rippling into view. It was her. It moved when she moved, blinked when she blinked. But her heart pounded anyway, her skin prickling with a sense she couldn't name. She stared into the water until the rest of the world blurred. "Do you know why we're here?" The voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Amira flinched, her eyes darting across the lake's surface. There was no one near her, no one who could have spoken, but her reflection hadn't moved. Its lips were still. "What do you want?" Amira whispered, her voice trembling. The reflection smiled, its expression slow and deliberate. "I want to go back." "Back where?" "To where I belong," it said simply. "And you're in my way." The water rippled, distorting the reflection, and for a moment, Amira thought she saw other shapes beneath the surface. Other faces, watching, waiting. She scrambled backward, her hands slick with damp earth, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The lake stilled, the reflection gone. By the time she returned to her apartment, the city felt different. Reflections in glass and water no longer behaved at all. They moved independently, passing like shadows in the corner of her vision. Each time, they smiled. Each time, they lingered longer. That night, Amira smashed every mirror in her apartment. The sound of shattering glass echoed into the early hours, leaving the floor glittering with shards that caught the dim light. When she finally collapsed onto her couch, exhausted and trembling, she swore she heard laughter in the stillness. The next morning, she woke to find her apartment pristine. The mirrors were whole, their surfaces unblemished, and her reflection was already waiting. This time, it didn't smile. It stepped forward. I was halfway through untangling a string of old Christmas lights when I realized they weren't mine. It was a small thing, barely noticeable at first, but it hit me all at once, like stumbling over a loose thread and finding it lead somewhere unexpected. The lights had been sitting in a dusty cardboard box labeled holiday stuff, a box I had assumed was mine because, well, I was the only one who lived in this apartment. I don't even decorate for Christmas, but I figured maybe someone gave them to me at some point and I'd stuffed them in a closet and forgotten about them. Except now that I was holding them, untangling their brittle wires, I knew they weren't mine. The colors were wrong. The bulbs were slightly bigger than the kind I would have bought, and the plugs had that faintly greasy texture of something older, something from another time. The box had come from the back of my bedroom closet, a space I avoided because it always smelled faintly of mildew no matter how many air fresheners I used. The closet was where I'd been storing the stuff I didn't know what to do with, the random pieces of my life that didn't fit neatly into drawers or shelves. A suitcase missing one wheel, a winter coat with a broken zipper, a set of ceramic bowls I'd inherited from my aunt and never had the heart to throw away, even though they were cracked. The box had been wedged behind all of it, out of sight and out of mind, until I decided to tackle the closet on a whim that morning. The box wasn't unusual. It was just a box. Cardboard, taped at the seams, a little saggy around the edges. I hadn't thought twice about it when I pulled it out and opened it up, but now, sitting on the floor with the lights draped across my lap, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd uncovered something I wasn't supposed to find. The rest of the box was just as strange. A stack of yellowed postcards tied together with twine, all blank except for the addresses on the back, places I didn't recognize. A tin of buttons, mismatched and scratched, some of them so small I wondered if they came from doll clothes. A pair of sunglasses with one lens missing, the frames warped as if they'd been left too long in the sun. And at the very bottom of the box, buried beneath a layer of crumpled tissue paper, a small leather notebook with a broken clasp. I hesitated before picking it up. There was something about the notebook that felt heavier than the other objects. Not physically. It was small, light enough to fit in the palm of my hand, but emotionally, like it carried something I wasn't sure I wanted to know. But curiosity has always been my Achilles heel. So I opened it. The pages were filled with cramped handwriting, slanted and hurried, as though whoever wrote them had too many thoughts and not enough time to get them down. Most of it didn't make sense, at least not at first. It wasn't a journal, not exactly. There were no dates, no entries about daily life or personal reflections. Instead, the notebook was filled with fragments, short sentences, lists, little bursts of ideas that felt half-formed, as if the writer had intended to come back and finish them but never did. The clock doesn't stop when you close your eyes. Who decides when a story is over? The lights blinked 3 times. Was it a warning? I flipped through the pages, trying to find some kind of pattern, but it was like chasing smoke. The fragments didn't fit together, at least not in any obvious way. There were drawings, too, small, rough sketches in the margins. A tree with twisted branches, a keyhole, a pair of shoes with one lace untied. None of it meant anything to me, but I couldn't stop reading, couldn't stop turning the pages, searching for something I couldn't name. And then I found the drawing of the Christmas lights. It was small, tucked into the corner of one page, almost like an afterthought. The lights were drawn in a single looping line, the bulbs spaced evenly apart, each one carefully colored in with faint red, green, and blue pencil. Beneath the drawing, in tiny, cramped letters, was a single word, signal. I stared at the page for a long time. The lights in the drawing weren't just similar to the ones in my lap. They were identical. Same colors, same spacing, same slightly oversized bulbs. It didn't make sense. How could this notebook, which clearly belonged to someone else, contain something so specific to the box I'd just found? I looked back at the other objects in the box, trying to see them in a new light. The sunglasses, the buttons, the postcards. They all felt connected now, but I couldn't figure out how. The more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed that the box had been in my closet at all. I didn't remember packing it, didn't remember bringing it with me when I moved into the apartment, but maybe I'd forgotten. Maybe it had come from my parents' attic, or from a thrift store haul I'd never gotten around to unpacking. That had to be it. There had to be a logical explanation. Still, the thought nagged at me. What if the box wasn't mine at all? What if it had been here when I moved in, hidden in the back of the closet, waiting for someone to find it? I spent the rest of the day with the box, unpacking and repacking its contents, trying to make sense of what I'd found. I held the postcards up to the light, searching for hidden messages. I laid the buttons out in neat rows, wondering if their colors or sizes might spell something out. I tried on the sunglasses, squinting through the one remaining lens, hoping they might reveal something I couldn't see otherwise. But nothing happened. The objects stayed stubbornly ordinary, as if refusing to give up their secrets. By the time the sun went down, I was exhausted. I shoved everything back into the box, closed the lid, and pushed it to the corner of the living room. I told myself I'd figure it out later, though I wasn't sure I believed it. The mystery felt too big, too tangled, and I was just one person with no idea where to start. That night, I dreamed about the lights. They were strung up in a dark room, flickering on and off in a rhythm that felt deliberate, like Morse code. I tried to follow the pattern, to decipher what they were saying, but every time I thought I'd figured it out, the rhythm changed. The lights blinked faster, brighter, until the whole room was filled with blinding flashes, and then I woke up, gasping, my heart pounding in my chest. I haven't opened the box again. It's still sitting in the corner of my living room, quietly waiting, as if it knows I'll come back to it eventually. And maybe I will. Or maybe I'll leave it there, let it gather dust until it becomes just another thing I don't know what to do with. Either way, I can't stop thinking about it. About the notebook, the lights, the fragments of someone else's life that somehow ended up in mine. I don't know if I'll ever find the answers I'm looking for, but part of me wonders if the answers even matter. Maybe the box was never about the answers. Maybe it was about the questions it left behind. What about you? Have you ever found something that felt like it didn't belong to you? Something that seemed to carry its own story, waiting for you to uncover it? And did you figure it out? Or are you, like me, still trying to decide if some mysteries are better left unsolved?